Hello everyone, I am the Creep's Cabin. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from? And what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I've always been drawn to the wilderness. Something about being alone in the vast, empty spaces of nature has always felt right to me. The quiet, the solitude, the way time seems to slow down when you're miles away from civilization. I've spent years taking solo trips into the mountains, camping in remote places where I wouldn't see another soul for days. Most of my run-ins with danger have involved animals, bears, mountain lions, even a moose once, but it's the encounters with people that have stuck with me the most. The one that unsettled me the most happened back in 2005. I was driving up a steep, rough road into the mountains of western Colorado, heading toward an old ghost town that had been abandoned for more than a century. The town was little more than scattered ruins, nothing but a few collapsed log cabins, stone foundations, and a graveyard with rusting iron crosses poking out of the tall grass. According to my map, the road ended there. Beyond that, it was nothing but forest, high-altitude meadows, and the crumbling remains of old mining operations. I planned to park at the town site and hike a few miles into the backcountry, setting up camp where I could spend a few days exploring before heading home. The road was rough, nothing but a narrow ribbon of dirt climbing higher into the mountains. The further I went, the worse it got: deep washboard ruts, loose gravel, jagged rocks sticking up like knives. My car, a reliable but aging SUV, wasn't handling it well. The engine temperature started creeping up, the gauge inching toward the red as I climbed higher. I eased off the gas, trying not to push it too hard, but by the time I reached the town site, the needle was hovering at the critical mark. I shut off the engine, popped the hood, and watched steam rise from the radiator. It was going to be a while before I could drive anywhere. The only good news was that I had made it to my destination before the car completely overheated. If I was lucky, letting it cool down for a few hours would be enough to get me back to the nearest town before nightfall. I had no cell service, no way to call for help if I got stranded, and I didn't want to risk spending the night out here with a dead vehicle. I spent the next few hours wandering around the town site. It was eerie, the way old mining towns always are. The place had been abandoned for over 100 years, but there were still traces of the people who had lived and died here. Rusting machinery half buried in the dirt, weathered wooden beams sticking up from the foundations of collapsed buildings, broken glass and ceramic shards scattered in the grass. A few mine entrances gaped like open mouths in the hillside, the tailings piles around them long since overgrown with weeds. The old graveyard was still visible, though most of the markers had been knocked over by time and weather. It was clear that no one had been up here in a long time. As the sun dropped lower, shadows stretching long across the ground, I heard the unmistakable sound of an engine coming up the road. It was an odd thing to hear. This was a dead-end road leading nowhere, and I had figured I'd be the only one crazy enough to come up here this late in the day. A beat-up white Honda Civic crested the hill, rattling over the rough terrain like it had no business being there. I remember wondering how it had even made it up the road in one piece. It pulled up beside my SUV and stopped, the engine shutting off. The driver's door opened, and a man climbed out. He was rough-looking, maybe in his mid-30s, with an unkempt beard and long, greasy hair. He wore a tattered flannel shirt, stained jeans, and boots that looked like they had seen better days. He moved slowly, deliberately, studying me as much as I was studying him. I was immediately on edge. There was no reason for anyone else to be here. This wasn't a tourist attraction or a popular campsite. It was the kind of place only people like me sought out, people who wanted to be alone. But I had driven up in broad daylight, with the innocent intention of hiking and camping. This guy had shown up at sundown, driving a car that looked like it was one bad bump away from falling apart. I didn't let my discomfort show. I nodded at him, and he nodded back. He asked if I needed help, and I explained my situation, how my car had overheated, how I was letting it cool down before heading back down the mountain. He listened, then told me that he was a miner. Not a legal, employed miner, but a drifter, moving from one abandoned claim to another, digging for whatever scraps of gold or silver might still be left. He had been injured on the job at some point, had no health insurance, and had found himself homeless, living out of his car and camping wherever he could. He said he knew the land well, better than anyone. The mines, the mountains, even the underground tunnels running beneath them. Then he told me he was heading to an abandoned mining camp a mile from where we stood. Said there was an old cabin there, still intact enough to sleep in, and that he planned to squat there for a few nights before moving on. He asked if I wanted to check it out with him. I hesitated. Everything about the situation felt wrong. But at the same time, I was curious. I liked exploring abandoned places, and if there was a hidden cabin out here, I wanted to see it. I went back to my car and grabbed my pack, making sure I had everything I needed: food, water, flashlight, extra layers. I also took my .44 Magnum revolver. I always carried it when I was deep in the wilderness, mostly as protection against animals. I usually kept it holstered on my belt, and when the guy saw it, his eyes widened. He asked what I intended to do with the gun. I told him it was just for self-defense. That seemed to satisfy him. We spent a little more time poking around the ruins before heading into the woods. I stopped back at my car a couple of times to grab things I had forgotten: a six-pack of beer, an extra flashlight. At some point, I decided to take my revolver off my belt and tuck it into my pack instead. It was a small decision, but looking back, I regret it more than anything else. The hike to the mining camp was short, maybe a mile through dense forest. When we arrived, I saw that he had been telling the truth. There was a single old cabin, weathered but still standing, and a rusting steel derrick above a vertical mine shaft. A bunch of junk was scattered around: old mining equipment, piles of debris, a few battered oil drums. We climbed onto the derrick and sat on a small platform, drinking beer and dropping empty bottles down the mine shaft. He claimed it was 700 feet deep, that he had worked in horizontal tunnels that intersected with it. We never heard the bottles hit bottom. They just disappeared into the darkness. Later, we built a fire in the cabin's old cast-iron stove. He shared his food, canned herring and crackers. I set up my bedroll on one side of the cabin, and he took the other. As we settled in for the night, he suddenly asked if I had brought my gun. Something about the way he asked sent a chill down my spine. I told him no, that I had left it in my car. I fell asleep uneasy. In the middle of the night, I woke up to a strange feeling. He was sitting up in his bedroll, not moving, not speaking, just watching me. I pretended to sleep. Eventually, I drifted off again. In the morning, we woke to a sound outside, a knocking on the cabin door. We stared at each other, frozen. Then we crept to the window and peered outside. Nothing. Later, I hiked back to my car and drove home. That night, as I unpacked my gear, I checked my revolver. The cylinder was empty. He had unloaded it while I slept. I never heard him, never felt a thing. I don't know what he was planning, but I've never slept so deeply in the wilderness again. I was 12 when it happened. To this day, I still don't like sleeping in a tent unless I'm surrounded by a group of people. Even then, I keep a knife close. I don't think I'll ever get past what happened that night. It was supposed to be a simple sleepover. My best friend, Josh, had invited me to camp in his backyard. We had been friends for years, practically growing up together. His backyard wasn't huge, but it was big enough for us to set up a tent and pretend we were deep in the woods instead of just a few feet away from his house. Josh had a dog, a big pit bull named Diesel. I loved that dog. He was built like a tank, all muscle, with a short brown coat and a square head. He looked intimidating, but he was sweet with people he knew. Diesel had this way of making me feel safe, and because of him, I decided to leave my tent open that night. I wanted him to come in and out as he pleased, maybe curl up next to me if he wanted. The backyard had a 3-foot fence around it. Not exactly the best for security, but it was enough to keep Diesel from wandering off. Josh's house was in a quiet neighborhood, not a place where people locked their doors religiously. The kind of place where you assumed bad things only happen somewhere else. We spent most of the evening running around the yard, playing with Diesel, and eating junk food. We talked about school, video games, and dumb kid stuff. It was just another regular night. By the time 11 p.m. rolled around, I was exhausted. Josh decided to sleep inside. I don't even remember why. Maybe he wanted to play video games until he passed out. But I wanted to sleep in the tent. Something about being outside, even if it was just a backyard, felt more adventurous. I got my blanket and pillow ready, settling in for the night. The air was cool but not cold, and the soft hum of crickets filled the yard. Diesel wandered around for a bit before finally plopping down next to me. I reached out and ran my fingers through his fur before drifting off to sleep. I don't know how long I was out, but I woke up when Diesel moved. He wasn't barking or growling, just shifting his weight as he lay down beside me. Half asleep, I reached out, feeling his warm body next to mine. Comforted by his presence, I closed my eyes again and let myself drift back into sleep. The next time I woke up, it was different. A low, rumbling growl vibrated through Diesel's chest. It wasn't playful or soft. It was deep guttural, the kind of sound that made my stomach drop. I opened my eyes, my brain still foggy with sleep. Diesel was no longer lying beside me. He was crouched at the entrance of the tent, his body tense, his ears pulled back. His entire posture had changed. Something was wrong. I turned my head to see what he was looking at, and that's when I saw him. There was a man standing just beyond the fence. At first, my tired brain didn't process it fully, but then the details sharpened. He was wearing a clown mask. Not the kind you see in cartoons, but one of those cheap, creepy Halloween masks with exaggerated features. The eyes were dark holes, empty and soulless. The mouth was stretched into a grin that wasn't real. He was holding something, a knife. My chest tightened so hard it felt like my ribs were caving in. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. I didn't move. I couldn't move. Diesel let out another growl, deeper this time, more aggressive. The man took a step closer. That was all Diesel needed. He lunged. There was no hesitation, no warning bark. 1 second Diesel was crouched beside me. The next he was flying through the air. The man barely had time to react before Diesel crashed into him, sending them both to the ground. The sound of their struggle shattered the silence. I scrambled backward, my heart hammering against my ribs. I could hear the man screaming, cursing, the knife clattering onto the grass. Diesel was all over him, snapping and snarling, his teeth flashing in the dark. I was screaming too. I don't remember deciding to scream. It just happened. Pure, raw terror ripped out of me. Then I heard another sound. A window slamming open. Josh's dad. His voice was muffled through the glass, but I heard movement. Then the front door burst open. I turned just in time to see him sprinting into the yard, a gun in his hand. "Get back," he shouted. Diesel had the man pinned, his jaws clamped onto the guy's arm. The man was thrashing, trying to get free, but Diesel was too strong. Josh's dad didn't hesitate. He stormed forward, grabbed Diesel's collar, and yanked him back. The second Diesel let go, the man tried to scramble to his feet. But it was too late. Josh's dad had the gun trained on him. The next few minutes were a blur. I remember the flashing red and blue lights, the cops flooding the yard, the neighbors peering out from their windows. I remember sitting on the back steps, shaking so hard I could barely breathe. Diesel sat beside me the entire time, panting but unharmed. The cops arrested the man right there in the yard. When they ran his info, the air got heavier. He had a record, 3 sex offenses, a warrant out for his arrest. He wasn't just some drunk idiot wandering into the wrong yard. He wasn't some dumb teenager pulling a prank. He was a predator, and he had a knife. I don't know what would have happened if Diesel hadn't been there. I don't want to know. After that night, everything changed. I stopped sleeping outside, even in the safest places. The world didn't feel as safe anymore. Josh's dad bought Diesel the biggest steak I'd ever seen. He deserved it. To this day, I owe that dog my life. When I first got married, my parents didn't live nearby. They were retired, enjoying life on the road, traveling in their RV. Every few months, they would come to our area and stay at a small RV park just outside of town. It wasn't much, just a gravel lot with a few picnic tables, some old trees providing patchy shade, and a cluster of trailers lined up side by side. But it was close, and it gave them a place to stay for weeks at a time without having to be cooped up in a hotel. They liked the freedom of it. My mom loved meeting other travelers, swapping stories about different parks, weather patterns, the best places to eat in whatever town they had just passed through. My dad mostly liked the quiet. Since they weren't around all the time, I made a habit of visiting them whenever they were in town. I'd stop by in the mornings before work, grab a coffee, sit with my dad in his little folding camp chair outside the RV, and just talk. Or more often, sit in silence and enjoy the morning air. He was never much for conversation, but he liked the company. That morning started like any other. The sky was still soft and gray, the sun just beginning to warm the tops of the trees. The RV park was mostly quiet, save for a few early risers walking their dogs or carrying plastic bags of trash to the rusted dumpster near the entrance. The air was crisp, the way it gets overnight in late spring when the temperature dips just enough to remind you that summer hasn't fully settled in yet. I parked my car on the gravel beside their RV and stepped out, stretching my arms. The door to the RV was closed, curtains drawn over the small windows. Nothing seemed unusual. I knocked lightly, out of habit more than necessity. My parents never locked their door during the day, and I had been told more than once to just come in. So I did. The moment I pushed the door open, I was hit with the smell. It was instant, thick, and overwhelming. Propane. It was so strong that my stomach turned. My head swam, and I instinctively took a step back, coughing as I sucked in a breath of fresh air. The smell clung to my clothes, my hair, the back of my throat. Inside, my dad was sitting in his chair near the little RV table, looking up at me like I was the one acting strange. His coffee sat untouched in front of him. His expression was neutral, maybe a little confused, but otherwise he seemed fine. I don't know how I managed to stay standing, how I forced myself to step back inside when my body was screaming at me to get out. The air was so heavy with gas that I could feel it pressing against my skin, as if the entire trailer had been wrapped in something thick and suffocating. I didn't understand how my dad wasn't reacting the way I was. Then it clicked. The propane had settled. I had stepped in from the outside, from fresh air into a confined space filled with gas. But my dad had been in it all night. He hadn't smelled it because the propane had slowly filled the trailer, creeping into every corner, sinking low into the step well near the door where it pooled undisturbed. The human nose isn't great at detecting gas when the change is gradual, when it builds up over hours instead of rushing in all at once. I felt like I was going to be sick. I forced myself to breathe shallowly, to ignore the dizziness creeping into the edges of my vision. My mom wasn't in sight. The bedroom area was separated by a thin curtain near the back of the trailer. I had a moment of pure, unfiltered panic. Had she woken up? Was she still breathing? I forced my feet to move. One step, then another. I reached for the window above the small kitchen counter and shoved it open with a clumsy, shaking hand. The latch caught for a second before giving way, and a rush of fresh air spilled inside, cutting through the thick wall of propane, just enough for me to think clearly. Then I heard movement. My mom's familiar shuffle as she stepped out from the back of the RV, rubbing her eyes, still wrapped in the blanket she always slept with. Her hair was messy, her expression groggy. Alive. I hadn't realized how tense I was until my knees nearly gave out. She squinted at me, then at the window, then at my dad, who was now finally reacting, sniffing the air, his face twisting as he started to register the situation. It took a few more minutes to piece it all together. The night before, my dad had cooked something simple, probably eggs or soup, something quick before bed. He had turned off the burner, or at least he thought he had, but it hadn't shut off completely. All night, gas had been leaking into the RV, slowly, quietly, a steady, invisible trickle. And the only reason I wasn't walking into a scene I wouldn't have been able to handle, the only reason I wasn't stepping into the aftermath of a silent, deadly accident, was my mom. My mom, who hates being cold. My mom, who never, ever sleeps with the window open. For some reason, in the middle of the night, she had cracked the small window next to their bed. She didn't remember why. Maybe she had been too warm under the blankets. Maybe she had felt a little stuffy. Maybe on some level, her body had sensed something was wrong. Whatever the reason, that tiny opening had been just enough to keep the air moving. Just enough to prevent the gas from reaching a lethal concentration. Just enough to keep them breathing. I spent the next half hour airing out the RV, opening every window, every vent. I stepped outside more than once, taking deep gulps of clean air before going back in. My dad, stubborn as ever, kept insisting he felt fine. My mom looked shaken, but tried to laugh it off. It took longer than I expected for the smell to fully clear. The propane had settled deep into the trailer, soaking into the air, clinging to the fabric of the seats, the curtains. Even when I couldn't smell it as strongly anymore, I still felt like it was there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting. It scared me more than I wanted to admit. Not just the gas itself, but the way it had crept in unnoticed. How close it had come to being something worse. Before I left that morning, I made them check the stove again. I watched as my dad turned each knob, confirming they were completely off. I showed them how to shut off the propane tank entirely when they weren't using it. I double-checked the carbon monoxide detector. Then, before I walked out the door, I turned back to look at them one more time. My mom, sitting on the edge of the small RV couch, rubbing her temples. My dad, still at the table, finally drinking his coffee. Alive. It didn't feel like enough, but it was. I had always loved football. Not the American kind, real football, the one the whole world played. I had followed Liverpool for years, watching matches on TV, reading about the club's history, and dreaming about the day I could finally stand on the terraces, shoulder to shoulder with thousands of others, feeling the pulse of the game in my chest. April 15th, 1989, was going to be that day. The FA Cup semi-final between Liverpool and Nottingham Forest was set to take place at Hillsborough Stadium in Sheffield. I had been lucky enough to get a ticket for the standing area behind the goal at the Leppings Lane end. It was a dream come true until it turned into a nightmare. The trip to Sheffield was buzzing with excitement. Fans packed into trains and buses, chanting, laughing, drinking. The air smelled of warm beer, sweat, and fried food from platform vendors. People were draped in scarves, red jerseys, some with painted faces. The energy was electric. I had come with a few mates, but we got separated in the chaos of travel. It didn't matter. In a crowd like this, everyone was a mate. The closer we got to the stadium, the tighter the streets became, filling with a flood of red. Outside the ground, there were police everywhere, but they seemed overwhelmed. I could already see the Leppings Lane entrance ahead, narrow, old turnstiles trying to process thousands of fans all pushing forward. The game was set to start at 3 p.m. By 2:30, it was clear that something was wrong. More and more people poured into the area outside the turnstiles. There were only 7 gates for all of us, and it was slow going. I was pinned between bodies, the heat rising, the air thick with the smell of sweat and anticipation. Then, at 2:52, someone made a decision that sealed our fate. A police officer ordered Gate C to be opened to relieve the crush outside. Thousands of us surged forward into the tunnel leading to the central pens behind the goal. I had no idea at the time that the side pens were mostly empty, that we were all being funneled into one overcrowded section. I was carried by the crowd, my feet barely touching the ground. There was no turning back. The tunnel was sloped, and as we poured down into the standing area, I felt the pressure build. I had been to matches before. I knew what a packed terrace felt like. This was different. It was like the air was being squeezed out of my lungs. The pen was already full, but people kept coming in. The crush came in waves. Every time the crowd behind pushed, we surged forward. I had no control over my body. By 2:58, my arms were pinned to my sides. My ribs felt like they were bending inward. I could barely move my head. I could hear screaming, but I couldn't tell where it was coming from. The whistle blew. The match started. I could see the pitch through the gaps between bodies. Players moving, the ball rolling, the crowd outside the pens roaring in excitement. But where I was, people were gasping, shouting for help, trying to climb the metal fence that separated us from the field. A man next to me collapsed. I don't even know if he fell or if his legs just stopped working. But he didn't go down. There was no space to fall. His head slumped forward onto someone's shoulder. I wanted to help him, but I couldn't move. It got worse. With every minute, the pressure grew. My chest felt like it was caving in. I couldn't expand my lungs. My mouth opened, sucking in air, but it wasn't enough. I could taste sweat, feel damp breath against my cheek. People tried to climb out, gripping the metal fence, their fingers curling around the bars. But they were pulled back down. A man in front of me had his face pressed so hard against the fence that his skin turned red, then purple. His eyes bulged. His lips moved, but no sound came out, and the game played on. At some point, I heard a woman's voice screaming for someone to open the gates. It was coming from the stands above us, where fans could see what was happening. The police stood in front of the fences, their backs to us, watching the match. A boy, not even a man, just a boy, was right in front of me. He was crying. His arms were pinned against his chest. His head was tilted back, mouth open, but I couldn't tell if he was breathing. I tried to push, but there was no give. It felt like being buried alive while standing up. Then people started dying. Bodies sagged. Eyes rolled back. Some people slumped forward against the fence, their weight held up only by the crush behind them. The screaming didn't stop. The game still hadn't stopped. I felt my own vision going dark. The lack of air made my head spin. My knees buckled, but I was held up by the people around me. Then, finally, the game stopped. Players were pointing at us. The crowd in the stands was shouting. Some police officers turned and saw what was happening, but it was already too late. The gate opened, and the pressure finally released. I was carried forward in a wave of bodies as people spilled onto the pitch. I hit the grass hard, sucking in air. My ribs ached. My legs felt weak. All around me, people were lying on the ground. Some moving, some not. I saw a man on his back, eyes open, mouth open, completely still. A father shaking his son, screaming his name. A woman with blood running from her nose, her lips blue. The pitch was littered with bodies. Some alive, some not. I couldn't tell how long I lay there, staring at the sky, my chest rising and falling, trying to convince myself that I was still alive. The ambulances came too late. The police had blocked them at first, thinking it was a riot. 96 people died. They blamed us. The newspaper said we were drunk, that we forced our way in, that it was our fault. I knew the truth. I had felt the life being squeezed out of people. I had seen the desperation in their eyes. For weeks, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the pressure again, heard the gasping, saw the faces pressed against the fence. Some nights, I wake up clawing at my own chest, convinced I can't breathe. Hillsborough wasn't a disaster. It wasn't an accident. It was a failure to listen, a failure to care, a failure that stole 96 lives and left thousands of us haunted forever. And the worst part, it could have been prevented. It never should have happened, but it did, and I will never forget. I remember the smell first. Not the blood, not the sweat, not even the rot, just the sharp, dry scent of sawdust. It filled the basement, thick enough to taste, sticking to the back of my throat. My father had been cutting wood for weeks, maybe months. Every night after dinner, he would go downstairs and turn on the saw, letting it hum and grind for hours. At first, I thought it was just a hobby, something to keep his hands busy. Then I realized he was preparing. He never left a single inch of the floor uncovered. I was his daughter. People always ask if I knew what was happening, if I understood. They ask if I was scared, if I wanted to stop it. But they don't understand how much I loved him. He was everything. My father, my protector, my God. When I closed my eyes at night, I saw his face. When I opened them in the morning, I waited for his voice. I lived inside the walls he built, obeyed every rule, and accepted every punishment. He hurt me, but love and pain had long since blurred into the same thing. He told me we were special, that we were different from the others, that we were chosen. When he first told me the plan, I didn't question it. I listened. I nodded. I understood. Because I was his daughter, and I would do anything for him. The first to die was my mother. He called her down into the basement late one evening. I stood at the top of the stairs, my fingers curled around the wooden railing. I could hear her footsteps, soft and slow, moving across the sawdust-covered floor. Then the gunshot. Just one. A sound so sudden and violent that it rattled the walls. My breath caught in my throat, but I didn't move. I didn't flinch. He had told me what it would be like. I had to be ready. I waited for the second one, then the third. The house went silent. I helped him clean. There was surprisingly little blood. The sawdust absorbed everything. It clumped together, turning dark and thick, but it never spread. There were no stains, no splatters, just small, neat patches of red hidden inside the piles of wood shavings. We shoveled it all into thick garbage bags and set them aside. He took out the saw, and I held the bodies down. It was harder than I expected. The skin resisted. The bones were thick. I had to push against the limbs, press them down while he worked. The sound was sickening. The way the flesh came apart, the way the bones cracked and gave way, the way the blade jumped and caught in places, none of it felt real. But I didn't stop, because I loved him. We didn't sleep that night. There was too much to do. We worked in silence, moving methodically. I held the flashlight while he poured the acid, watching as the flesh bubbled and dissolved. The smell was worse than anything I had ever known. It burned my nose, my throat, my eyes. But I didn't turn away. We flushed the remains down the drain, one bucket at a time. By the time the sun rose, there was nothing left. No blood, no bodies, no evidence. Just bags of sawdust and the faint, lingering smell of chemicals. And it was perfect. For days, we acted normal. We smiled. We ate breakfast. We went outside. When people asked where my mother and siblings had gone, he had an answer ready. They left, he told them. They wanted a new life. And they believed him. There was no reason not to. No signs of a struggle. No missing persons reports. No one had heard a single scream. It was perfect. His only mistake was the acid. He had bought too much too quickly. The store clerks had noticed. They had talked. Someone had gotten suspicious. And then the police came. At first, he was calm. He always was. He had a way of making people believe him. He spoke slowly, carefully. He smiled. He told them what he had told everyone else. They left, but they didn't believe him. Not this time. They searched the house. They searched the basement. They found nothing. No blood, no bodies, no stains. But then they checked the drains. Traces of human remains. And suddenly, it wasn't perfect anymore. I remember the handcuffs. Cold metal snapping around his wrists. I remember his face. Blank. Expressionless. He didn't look at me. He didn't speak. I waited for him to tell me what to do. I waited for him to give me a sign. But he never did. And then he was gone. People ask me if I regret it. If I hate him now. If I understand what he did to me. I tell them what they want to hear. I tell them I was brainwashed. I tell them I was a victim. I tell them I didn't know any better. But deep down, in the darkest part of me, I still love him. I always will. Because I was his daughter. And I would have done anything for him. Even now. Even after everything. I would still do it. I never thought I'd quit. I'd been working as a tow truck driver for 10 years, running overnight calls all across the county. I'd seen everything. Cars crushed like tin cans, twisted metal, people in worse conditions than I'd ever describe out loud. You can't do a job like this and have a weak stomach. The first few times you pull up to a wreck and see something awful, it gets to you. It stays in your head when you try to sleep. But after a while, it's just another part of the job. That's what I always told myself. That's what I told the younger drivers when they asked how I dealt with it. I told them you just get used to it. But the night I quit, I learned that wasn't true. It was a Sunday, around 3 in the morning. The whole week had been nothing but rain. One of those stretches where everything stays damp no matter what you do, and the roads get slicker than you'd expect. I'd already taken 2 calls that night. One for a stranded driver who hit a deep puddle and flooded his engine. Another for a car that slid into a ditch and needed winching out. I was heading back toward town when I saw headlights in my rearview mirror, coming fast. I barely had time to register what kind of car it was before it flew past me. A Corvette. The driver must have been doing at least 80, maybe more. The back tires sent up a spray of water as they cut across the wet pavement, and right before a sharp bend in the road, he moved to pass me. I knew what was about to happen before it even did. The turn was completely blind. No way he saw how sharp it was. No way he had the traction to correct in time. I let off the gas and watched as the car veered sideways. The road curved left. He tried to follow it, but the rear end kicked out. For a split second, I thought he might recover. He overcorrected, then overcorrected again, and by then it was too late. The car left the road, tires hitting the wet grass. It barely slowed down before it hit the streetlight. I'll never forget the sound. It wasn't just a crash. It was metal folding in on itself, glass shattering. An impact so loud it felt like the air was punched out of my lungs just hearing it. The pole bent inward from the force of the hit, but it didn't fall. The front end of the Corvette had taken the worst of it, wrapped so tightly around the pole that the entire shape of the car had changed. And the driver? He wasn't in the car anymore. I didn't even put the truck in park. I just threw it into neutral, yanked the brake, and was out of the cab before I'd even thought about it. I sprinted toward the wreck, scanning the ground, looking for where he might have landed. I found him 20 feet away. He was on his hands and knees, body rocking slightly, head hanging low. I don't know how he was still conscious. I don't know how he was even alive at that moment. I started yelling, telling him not to move. I'd seen people break their necks, their backs, their legs in crashes, and not realize it because of the adrenaline. You're never supposed to move an injured person unless there's immediate danger, and I wasn't going to risk making his injuries worse. But as I got closer, I noticed something was wrong. Something worse than I'd thought. He wasn't just bracing himself on the ground. He was scraping at it. His fingers dug into the wet asphalt, slipping, fumbling. His arms shook as he scooped at the pavement, like he was trying to pick something up. I took another step forward, and then I saw it. His stomach was open. It wasn't a clean wound. It wasn't just a cut. He had been thrown through the windshield, and the glass had torn him open. His entire midsection was a mess of red, dark, and slick under the glow of the streetlight. His intestines had spilled out onto the road. A thick loop of them hung from his open abdomen, draped against the wet pavement, and he was trying to put them back. His hands scooped at the slick, bloody mass, slipping as he tried to lift it. His breathing was ragged, short gasps that sounded more like choking than anything else. His arms trembled as he cradled what he could and tried to shove it back into his body. But there was too much, and his hands weren't working right. His fingers couldn't hold on to anything. He tried again and again, but every time, the mess of tissue slipped right back out, spilling over his palms and onto the ground beneath him. I stopped. I stopped moving, stopped talking, stopped thinking. For the first time in my 10 years of doing this job, I felt something I'd never felt before. Fear. I had seen dead bodies before. I had seen people torn apart in wrecks, seen things that would make most people vomit the second they laid eyes on them. But this was different. He wasn't dead. Not yet. And he knew it. I could see it in the way he moved, the way he tried so desperately to hold himself together. Literally. I knew I needed to call for help. I knew I needed to do something. But for the first time in my life, I was frozen. My body refused to listen to my brain. I could do nothing but watch. Watch as his movements got weaker. Watch as his breathing became more ragged. Watch as his body slumped forward, his arms giving out beneath him. He fell face first onto the pavement. The last of what he had been trying to hold onto spilled out completely. His fingers twitched once, twice, and then stopped moving altogether. I stood there for what felt like forever. Eventually, I forced myself to call it in. My voice didn't even sound like mine. The dispatcher on the other end asked me to repeat myself, and I barely got the words out. By the time EMS arrived, it didn't matter. It wouldn't have mattered even if they'd been parked a mile up the road. There was no saving him. I didn't stay much longer. The cops got my statement, but I barely remember what I told them. I barely remember driving home. I barely remember quitting. I just know I never went back. I still see it sometimes. When I close my eyes. When I least expect it. The way his hands moved. The way he fought to keep himself together, even when it was impossible. I don't work as a tow truck driver anymore. I don't go near accident scenes. And I don't feel bad about quitting. Some things you just don't get used to. There are some things you see on this job that stay with you forever. Not because you want them to, not because they mean something personal to you, but because they get burned into your mind in a way that nothing else ever does. I've seen a lot over the years. Car crashes with bodies mangled in ways you wouldn't think possible. Apartment fires where people didn't make it. Suicides where you walk in and immediately wish you hadn't. But this one stuck with me more than most. It was 1995, mid-November. A cold night, around 11 p.m., when the call came in. House fire. Residential. Full involvement. That meant the place was already swallowed in flames, and our job was to get there fast and try to save whoever was inside, if we could. We rolled out from the station in under a minute, sirens wailing, tires screeching on the pavement as we tore down empty streets. It was a quiet part of town, mostly older houses, the kind with wooden siding and attics filled with decades of dust. Fires moved fast in places like that, sometimes too fast. I was in the back of the truck, running through the usual checklist in my head. Air pack, check. Gloves, check. Axe, check. Everything needed to be ready the second we arrived, because every second counted. There were 5 of us on the truck, myself, my lieutenant, and 3 others. We didn't talk much on the way. We never really did on calls like this. When we got to the house, the fire was already raging. Flames climbed out of the windows, licking at the night sky, lighting up the neighborhood in an orange glow. Thick, black smoke poured out of the roof. From the street, I could see the silhouettes of people, neighbors most likely, standing outside in their pajamas, watching in horror. Some of them had their hands over their mouths. The worst part, though, was the family. A woman and a man, both in their 30s, stood on the sidewalk screaming. The mother was hysterical, clutching at her husband's arms, her face streaked with soot and tears. The father looked dazed, like he couldn't understand what was happening. 2 kids, we were told. 1 boy, 1 girl. They'd managed to get the girl out, but the boy, he was still inside. We moved fast. My lieutenant started barking orders, directing hoses to the front of the house, where the fire was the worst. The heat was brutal, even from a distance. I could feel it pressing against my skin, thick and suffocating, even through my gear. We went in through the side door, forcing it open with a halogen. Smoke billowed out the second the door cracked open, thick and acrid, stinging my eyes even through the mask. Inside, it was chaos. The living room was already charred black, furniture reduced to burning skeletons. The fire crackled and popped, hungry, devouring everything it touched. The heat made it hard to think, let alone move, but we had a job to do. We pushed forward, stepping over collapsed beams, dodging embers falling from the ceiling. We had a rough idea of the layout. The family had given us a quick rundown before we went in. The boys' room was down a hallway, past the living room, at the far end of the house. But that hallway was completely engulfed. There was no way through. Then we heard it. Not a scream, not a cry for help, just a sound, the rushing of water. I was the first to reach the bathroom. The door was closed, but when I pushed it open, I saw the tub, full. The water was still steaming. And there, in the water, was the boy. He was small, maybe 6 years old, his tiny frame curled up in the tub, as if he had simply lain down and gone to sleep. At first, it didn't make sense. Fires didn't leave bodies looking like that. Then I realized what had happened. He had tried to save himself. Somewhere in his little mind, he must have thought water would protect him from the fire. Maybe he had seen it in a movie. Maybe it was just instinct. Maybe he had been told once that water put out fire, and he thought it would work for him too. So he had filled the tub, climbed in, curled up, waited, but the smoke got him first. By the time we found him, it was too late. I moved quickly, stepping toward the tub to lift him out. The water was still warm. But as soon as my partner grabbed him by the legs, his hands slipped. For a second, I didn't understand what had happened. Then I saw his gloves. The way they glistened. The skin had come off. Just like that. It peeled away, just like the skin on a boiled potato. For a moment, neither of us moved. My partner stood there frozen, staring at his hands, at the loose, pink flesh clinging to his gloves. I had to take over. I reached into the tub, gripping the boy carefully, making sure not to let the same thing happen again. His body was limp, boneless, too soft in a way that made my stomach turn. I lifted him out, cradling him as best as I could. His eyes were closed. We carried him out of the house in silence. By the time we got back outside, the fire was mostly out. Smoke still billowed from the house, thick and heavy, but the flames had been beaten back. The mother was still there, her hands gripping her husband's shirt. When she saw us, saw what we were carrying, she collapsed. The sound she made, deep, raw, broken, was the kind of sound that sticks with you forever. I don't remember much of what happened after that. I remember the ambulance arriving. I remember my partner taking off his gloves, staring at them like they weren't his own hands. I remember the way the cold air felt on my face after we took off our masks, how my lungs burned from all the smoke. I remember the drive back to the station, the silence between us. I remember going home that morning, scrubbing my hands in the sink even though they weren't dirty, standing there for what felt like hours. And I remember not being able to sleep. For a long time, my partner didn't either. He took time off, said he couldn't get the image out of his head. The kid in the tub, the skin peeling away. The worst part was knowing that he had tried to save himself. That, right up until the end, he had thought he was doing the right thing. That he had died believing he might still make it. We never talked about it much after that. Some things are just too hard to say out loud. I've never been able to shake what happened that day. I don't talk about it much, but sometimes late at night, I still see it in my mind. The moment everything changed, the moment that broke people. It wasn't the kind of thing you'd ever expect in a place like that. We dealt with messes, sure. Blood, waste, fluids from people in pain, suffering, dying. It was a part of the job. You had to shut off a part of your mind to it. But what happened that day wasn't something you could block out. I worked at an industrial laundry facility, one that handled linens from hospitals, care homes, and other medical businesses. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady work. The place ran like a machine, trucks pulling in, unloading carts of soiled sheets, scrubs, and towels. Workers sorted them into massive industrial washers built to handle loads bigger than a person. High heat, strong chemicals, bleach, everything needed to strip away bacteria, biohazards, and the worst of human existence. The process was routine. Linens came in, got washed, dried, pressed, folded, and sent back out. Day in, day out. It was loud, hot, and smelled of detergent and bleach. The machines rumbled constantly, and the air was thick with steam. Everyone moved fast, handling load after load, not thinking too hard about what they were touching. If you thought about it too much, you wouldn't last long. That day started like any other. Trucks pulled up, unloading metal carts full of hospital laundry. The carts were wheeled onto the sorting floor, where workers tossed the linens into massive washers, then moved on to the next load. The machines did the real work, boiling water, chemicals strong enough to eat through fabric over time, spinning with a force that could tear flesh from bone. No one knew anything was wrong until the scream. It was piercing, cutting through the usual hum of machines, through the shouts of workers and the clang of metal carts. I was a few stations down when it happened. I turned just in time to see one of the workers stumble back from the conveyor belt where the washed linens dropped out, his face twisted in something beyond fear. He was shaking, hands clenched, but it was his eyes that stuck with me, wide, unblinking, like he wasn't seeing the world around him anymore. And then I saw what he had seen. There, tangled among the damp sheets, was something that shouldn't have been there. At first, my mind refused to understand it. My stomach twisted as I stared, as my brain pieced together what I was looking at. It was small, tiny, too small, burned, twisted, a baby. There was nothing left of softness. The boiling water had done its work. The chemicals, the heat, the endless tumbling, it had reduced what should have been delicate to something unrecognizable. The skin was darkened, almost cooked. The tiny limbs were locked in an unnatural position, stiff and wrong. The features were gone, melted into a form that barely resembled a human being. The blanket it had been wrapped in was in pieces, threads of fabric fused to its body. No one moved. No one spoke. The conveyor belt kept moving, the freshly washed linens sliding out one by one, bumping against the thing that shouldn't have been there. It was unreal. Someone vomited. Someone else collapsed. I couldn't take my eyes off it. The silence shattered as people started yelling. The machines were shut off, the building thrown into chaos. Managers rushed in, pushing through the crowd of stunned workers. Someone yanked the conveyor's emergency stop, the clanking and whirring of the factory falling into an eerie quiet. The police were called. The plant shut down. We all stood there waiting, but for what, I didn't know. I didn't realize I was shaking until I looked down at my hands. The investigation started immediately. We were questioned, but none of us had any answers. The police followed the laundry back to the source, retracing the path of the cart. It led to a hospital, a maternity ward. The truth was even worse than what my mind had imagined. It had been a stillborn, a baby that never took a breath, never cried. It had been placed in a cot, wrapped in a blanket, left in the delivery room for a brief moment. The parents had said their goodbyes. A nurse was supposed to take it to the morgue. Somehow it never made it there. A new nurse had come on shift, saw the cot, saw the linens, and without realizing what was inside, she gathered everything up, the sheets, the blankets, the baby, and dumped them into the hospital's laundry bin. From there, it was just a routine process. A cart was wheeled down to the hospital's laundry collection point, loaded onto a truck, driven to our facility. No one checked. No one saw. By the time it hit the machines, it was too late. I don't remember leaving work that day. I don't remember the drive home. I just remember sitting in my apartment, staring at my hands, trying to scrub something away that wasn't there. The fallout was immense. The hospital faced a storm of outrage. The parents, God, I can't even imagine. They thought their child had been taken to the morgue. Instead, it had been treated like trash, sent through an industrial wash cycle, reduced to something less than human. The hospital changed its protocols. Every body, even stillborns, would be transported immediately, no exceptions. No one would be left in a cot waiting. Our plant was cleared of blame, but it didn't matter. The damage had been done. The workers who had seen it, who had pulled that tiny, ruined body from the sheets, most of them never came back. Counseling was offered. Some took it. Others just disappeared. I stayed, but I was never the same. The smell of bleach made me sick for months. Every time I saw a laundry cart, my stomach clenched. I couldn't stop thinking about it, about how easy it had been, how no one had noticed. We changed our own procedures. No more dumping carts straight into the machines. Every load was inspected by hand before it went in. It slowed things down, but no one complained. We all knew why. We all remembered. Time passed. The plant went back to running like normal. But for me, normal didn't exist anymore. Some nights, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how small it had been, about how it never should have ended up where it did. I try to tell myself it was a mistake, a horrible, tragic accident. But the truth is, it never should have happened at all. And no matter how much time passes, I know I'll never forget. Ever. I was 15 when it happened. At that age, I didn't think much about danger. I knew the world wasn't all good, but I also believed most people wouldn't hurt me. I wasn't naive, just young. I trusted the routine of my life, trusted my town, trusted that as long as I stuck with people I knew, nothing bad could happen. That day was just like any other. My friend's quinceañera was coming up, and I was part of the group learning the dances. We practiced at her house, which was always full, her siblings running in and out, music playing, the smell of food in the kitchen. I was the only white kid in the group, but no one made a big deal out of it. I was used to it. It was normal. Dance practice had run late, and by the time we finished, the sun had started setting. It was that weird time of evening where the sky still held some light, but the street lights were flickering on, one by one. The air had cooled down, and my legs were sore from practicing the same steps over and over. I just wanted to get home, shower, and sleep. We called for a taxi like we always did. In our small town, it wasn't uncommon to see unmarked taxis. A lot of them were run by small businesses, usually through word of mouth, and we had taken rides like this before. It never felt unsafe. The taxi that pulled up that evening was a busted-up minivan. The paint was faded, the headlights a little dim. It didn't look official, but that wasn't strange. The driver was an older Hispanic man, big, with a thick mustache and a belly that pressed against the steering wheel. I didn't think much of him at first. There were 3 of us taking the taxi, me and 2 other girls from dance practice. They knew Spanish way better than I did, so they told him where to take me first. I felt relieved. They would help direct him. I wouldn't have to stumble through broken Spanish trying to explain my street. But something felt off. The way he asked where they lived made my skin prickle. He should have been focused on taking me home first, but instead, he wanted to know where they lived. I couldn't understand everything he was saying, but I caught enough to know he wasn't asking just to be polite. The girls gave him their address, and instead of taking me home, he drove straight to their house first. I didn't say anything. I was uncomfortable, but I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe he just wanted to drop them off quickly before heading to my place. No big deal. The girls got out, chatting and laughing like nothing was wrong. The door slammed shut, and just like that, I was alone with him. The car felt smaller. The sounds of the street outside, the hum of distant traffic, the occasional dog barking, faded into the background. My senses sharpened. My breath felt too loud. I told myself to relax. Then he spoke. I got this job to pay for my family a vacation. I wanted to believe him. A family man. A hard worker. Someone just trying to provide for his wife and kids. It made me feel a little safer. But then we reached my street. I pointed. Turn right here. The van kept going. It took me a second to process it. My stomach dropped, my pulse spiking. Maybe he didn't hear me. Maybe he was distracted. I pointed again. Here. You need to turn here. Nothing. My hands started sweating. My fingers gripped the door handle. Then he said it. You are very beautiful. You should let me take you to eat. Everything inside me locked up. I forced my voice to stay steady. No, I want to go home. Come on, aren't you hungry? Let's get something to eat. His voice was too casual, too relaxed, like we were on a date. My brain screamed that this wasn't normal, that I needed to get out. But I was frozen. No, I said again. Take me home. The van slowed down, but instead of turning around, he pulled into an empty parking lot behind a closed store. My breath caught in my throat. The lot was dark. No people. No cameras. Just cracked pavement and the glow of distant streetlights. My whole body went cold. I knew. He leaned over. His arm moved toward the back of my seat. My body finally reacted. I turned my head, met his eyes, and forced every ounce of fear and anger into my voice. Take me home. Now. The words came out like a command, sharp and firm. I didn't beg. I didn't plead. I ordered him. His hand hesitated. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. For a second, I thought he might laugh, that he might shrug and keep pushing. But something in my face must have told him I wasn't playing along. He exhaled through his nose, put the van in reverse, and pulled out of the lot. I stayed rigid, my fingers still gripping the door handle. The drive felt like forever. My street was coming up again. I didn't want him to know where I lived. "Drop me off here," I said. My voice was flat, empty. He glanced at me. "Can I have your number?" I ignored him. The van slowed, and before it fully stopped, I yanked the handle and shoved the door open. I stepped out like I belonged there, like this was my house. I walked up the driveway of an elderly couple's home, not looking back. I didn't breathe until I heard the van's engine fade into the distance. Then I ran. I sprinted through the woods, branches scraping my arms, my feet pounding against the dirt. I didn't stop until I reached my actual house. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone and called my friends. Their parents were furious. They called the taxi company. The driver was fired immediately. For weeks, I looked over my shoulder. Every time I saw a van, my stomach clenched. I wondered if he was mad, if he would come back, if I had been seconds away from something much worse. Even now, I think about it. About how easily I got in that car. About how fast things can turn. About the moment I stopped being a kid who thought nothing bad could happen. That night, I learned a lesson I never wanted to learn. Camping in October always had a different feeling than summer. The air smelled sharper, the trees looked older, and the whole forest seemed quieter, like it was waiting for something. This trip was no different. Our Boy Scout troop had come out to a massive reserve in the Midwest, a place that could hold more than 1,000 scouts during the summer. But now, with the season over, it was just us, 30 or so guys and our adult leaders. I'd been in scouts long enough to know the drill. Set up camp, cook over the fire, hike until our legs felt like rubber, and fall asleep in our tents listening to the night sounds. The usual. But this trip was different. The first thing I noticed was the stillness. The air felt thick and heavy, like the whole place was holding its breath. October in the Midwest could be unpredictable, but we'd had 3 straight days of unseasonable warmth and dead calm. No wind through the trees. No sudden cold snaps. Just an eerie, lingering silence. The second thing was the feeling of being watched. I chalked it up to the emptiness of the place. When a campground that normally held over 1,000 people was reduced to just 30, it made sense that it felt hollow. But even still, something about it didn't sit right. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Guys were quieter than usual. No pointless arguments. No one wandering off alone. It wasn't fear exactly, just a weird kind of unease, like we weren't as alone as we should have been. But the weirdest part? That came on our last day. We had packed up our gear, doused the fire, and loaded everything into the cars. The last thing we had to do was a litter line, standard practice in scouts. Everyone stands shoulder to shoulder and walks the length of the campsite, scanning the ground to make sure we aren't leaving behind any trash. We took our places and started moving. The ground was covered in dry, early autumn leaves. They crunched under our boots as we walked, eyes down, scanning for stray pieces of paper, bottle caps, anything that shouldn't be there. The wind had been dead for days, and the air was thick and warm, unusual for this time of year. Sweat prickled at the back of my neck as I trudged forward, kicking through leaves, scanning. Then someone stopped. I found a coup. The words cut through the silence like a knife. I stopped walking. Everyone did. Coup were rare. They weren't just beads. They were personal, custom-shaped pieces made when someone joined the Reserve's Leadership Society, a group that was kind of an extension of the Boy Scouts with a strong Native American influence. Every coup was unique to the scout who earned it, a reflection of their skills, personality, or something meaningful to them. I looked over. The guy who found it held up his palm, and resting in the center was a small, intricately carved bead, shaped like a tornado. A single moment passed. Then, before anyone could react, hush, a wind slammed through the campsite. Not a breeze, not a sudden gust. A howling, cold wind that roared through the trees, sending leaves flying, whipping against my skin, rattling branches, shaking the earth beneath my feet. I stumbled, bracing myself. My heart punched against my ribs. For 3 days, we'd had nothing. No wind, no movement in the air. And now, The very second a carved tornado coup was found, the trees groaned as if something massive had just passed through. The leaves that had coated the ground in a dry, brittle carpet lifted into the air, swirling and twisting before being ripped away. The noise was deafening, wind screaming through branches, snapping twigs, shoving against us with violent force. Then, as suddenly as it had come, silence. The wind stopped. Just like that. The leaves that had been sent flying drifted down again, settling in random places. The branches were still. The trees stood tall and unmoving, like nothing had happened. But something had happened. The air felt different now. Charged. Like the last crackling second before a lightning strike. Nobody spoke. I don't think any of us knew what to say. The guy who had found the coup was still holding it, his fingers clamped around the small bead. His face was pale, his lips slightly parted. No one wanted to stand there any longer. Someone muttered, "Litter line looks good." That was all it took. We turned and walked back to the cars, fast but trying not to seem like we were rushing. The unease I'd felt since the start of the trip had finally reached its peak. I climbed into my seat, buckled in, and stared out the window as we pulled away. The forest passed by in a blur of orange and brown, but my mind was locked on one thing. Coups don't just get lost. Each one was personal. Scouts who joined the society guarded them carefully. If a coup was lost, it was either because the owner had abandoned it, asterisk asterisk, or they weren't around to keep it anymore, asterisk asterisk. And this one had been shaped like a tornado. Had someone carved it because of a storm? Had something happened here, years ago, that no one ever talked about? I didn't know. I still don't. But I do know one thing. That wind wasn't natural. Camping in Ocala National Forest sounded like a great idea when my friends first brought it up. We were in high school, bored of the same weekend routines, and looking for something different, something with a little adventure. The forest was massive, stretching for miles, full of trails, rivers, and thick patches of trees that felt endless. We planned to spend 2 nights out there, away from everything, just a group of us with tents, a campfire, and a cooler packed with enough food and drinks to last the weekend. The first night was uneventful. We set up our tents, gathered firewood, and sat around, talking and laughing. The sounds of the forest were constant. The chirping of insects, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustling of leaves as small animals moved around. There was no wind that night, and the air sat heavy and warm, thick with humidity. The fire crackled in front of us, casting flickering shadows against the trees. It felt safe. By the second night, things changed. We got a little too comfortable, a little too restless. Someone, maybe Rob, maybe Jake, suggested we sneak off for a bit, go explore past the main trails. Not far, just to see what was out there. We had flashlights, a couple of knives for protection, and that reckless high school mindset that made us feel untouchable. So we left. It was me, Rob, Jake, and maybe one other guy. I don't even remember now. We stepped off the main trail, our boots crunching over fallen leaves and twigs, our flashlights bouncing off the trees. The deeper we went, the quieter it felt. No more sounds of our friends back at camp, just the occasional flicker of distant firelight behind us. The trail we followed was narrow and uneven, winding through the woods before sloping downward. We pushed forward, brushing past hanging vines and stepping over thick roots. The smell of damp earth filled the air, mixed with the faint, musky scent of something rotting further in the woods. Probably an animal, we told ourselves. Then suddenly we saw headlights. The trail had led us to the edge of a highway. It wasn't a major road, just a 2-lane stretch cutting through the forest, mostly deserted at this hour. It felt like we had stumbled onto something we weren't supposed to see, even though it was just a road. We sat down in the grass, hidden by a few bushes, watching the road for no real reason. It was quiet, except for the occasional rustling in the trees. Nothing unusual. We were about to head back when we heard it, the low rumble of an approaching engine. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, growing brighter as the vehicle neared. It was an older car, maybe a truck. As it passed, someone whispered, "Duck down." Without thinking, we did. The truck kept going for a few more seconds, then its red taillights flared as it came to a sudden stop. The engine cut off. The doors creaked open, then slammed shut. Footsteps. Heavy ones. Fast ones. Coming straight for us. We didn't wait. We ran. I don't remember who started running first, but But once one of us bolted, we all did. We tore through the underbrush, snapping branches under our feet, flashlights swinging wildly in our hands. The footsteps behind us weren't slowing. Whoever was chasing us wasn't just walking, they were running, sprinting after us. The moment we left the road and entered the trees, we could hear them crashing through the brush behind us. Leaves rustled, branches snapped, the sound of heavy breathing mixed with the pounding of our own footsteps. I didn't dare look back. The trees became a blur as we sprinted forward, dodging low branches, tripping over roots. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop. The camp was close, just through the trees, past a small clearing, maybe another 100 yards. Then Rob stopped short. Banana spider. I nearly slammed into him. Hanging right in front of him, stretching across the trail, was a massive web, and in the center sat the biggest banana spider I had ever seen. Its long legs stretched out, motionless, waiting. Rob froze. I didn't. I remembered what was behind us. "Not today, motherfucker," I screamed, shoving Rob straight through the web. He flailed, arms flapping wildly as he stumbled forward, the web wrapping around him, the spider probably freaking out just as much as he was. I didn't stop. I shoved past him and kept running. Behind us, the crashing sounds had slowed. Maybe they had seen the spider too. Maybe they thought we weren't worth it anymore. Maybe they had just wanted to scare us. I didn't care. We burst into the clearing where our campfire still burned, our friends sitting around laughing, completely unaware of what had just happened. We didn't stop running until we reached them, panting, dripping sweat, barely able to get words out. They stared at us like we were insane. I turned back toward the trees, expecting to see figures standing just beyond the firelight, waiting, watching, but there was nothing. Just darkness, just the forest. We never saw who chased us, never figured out what they wanted. We didn't go back to that spot, didn't talk much about it after that night. The next morning, when we packed up to leave, I kept my eyes on the trees, half expecting to see a figure standing just inside the shadows, waiting for us to come back. But there was nothing, just the forest, just silence, and maybe that was worse. Hurricane Wilma hit us hard. The power went out early in the morning, long before the worst of the storm even arrived. My parents and I huddled in the house, listening to the wind howl outside. It wasn't our first hurricane, but Wilma felt different. The pressure in the air was heavy, pressing against the walls like an invisible weight. The trees bent and snapped, debris slammed against the house, and the rain came down in sheets so thick you couldn't see more than a few feet outside. By the time the storm passed, everything was a mess. Trees were uprooted, fences were down, and the entire neighborhood was dark. No power, no air conditioning, no way to keep the food in the fridge from going bad. Just a battery-powered radio and a handful of flashlights to get us through the night. We didn't have a generator. My parents had talked about getting one, but it was one of those things they never got around to buying. The neighbor behind us, though, he had one. Their house was set up almost exactly like ours. Same shape, same layout, just reversed. Our backyards were separated by a wooden fence, and since the trees that used to give us a little privacy had been torn apart by the storm, we could see straight into each other's yards. Their house stood out in the darkness. While the rest of the neighborhood sat in eerie silence, their lights glowed warmly behind the windows. Their fridge hummed. Their stove worked. They were probably the only people within a 5-block radius who weren't eating canned beans by candlelight. That second night without power, my father was outside checking on the yard when he noticed the man next door standing by the fence. They started talking, their voices low in the humid night air. I stood near the back door listening. The neighbor's generator gave off a steady, comforting hum, almost drowning out the sound of distant sirens. He invited us over for dinner. My parents hesitated, but it was hard to turn down a hot meal after 2 days of eating whatever we could scrounge from the pantry. Inside their house, it was like stepping into another world. Cool air from their running fans brushed against my skin. The lights cast a soft yellow glow over everything. The smell of cooked food, real, hot food, filled the air. I remember sitting at their dining table, watching the 2 little girls, maybe 5 and 7 years old, as they played with their toys in the next room. The wife made chicken and rice. It tasted better than it probably was, just because I was sick of eating peanut butter sandwiches and canned soup. We ate. We talked. It was nice, almost normal. but the curfew meant we couldn't stay late. Not long after dark, my parents and I walked back to our house, using our flashlights to cut through the thick blackness that covered the neighborhood. The rest of the night was uneventful, at least for a little while. We sat in the den, talking about nothing, the way you do when there's nothing else to do. The radio crackled with updates about the power grid and which roads were still blocked. The heat clung to us like a second skin, but we were getting used to it. Then my father stood up and looked out the window. His posture changed. He leaned in slightly, then turned back toward us. "There's someone in their backyard." At first, I thought he was joking, but then I saw his face. He wasn't the type to joke about things like that. He grabbed his flashlight and reached for his phone. I sat up, suddenly alert, listening as he called the neighbors. The wife answered. He asked if her husband was outside looking for something, told her we had extra flashlights if he needed help. She made a strange noise, halfway between confusion and alarm. Then in the background, I heard a man's voice. My father stayed on the line for a few more seconds before hanging up. He looked at us. It wasn't him. A few minutes later, the neighbors rushed toward the back of their house, straight into their daughter's bedroom. When they looked out the window, they saw him. A man standing there in the darkness, watching. His face was obscured in the shadows, but they could see him clearly enough to notice one horrifying detail. His pants were partially down. As soon as they locked eyes, he bolted. They called the police, but by the time officers arrived, the man was long gone. There wasn't much they could do except take a report. They asked around, checked with other neighbors, but most people were inside, too caught up in their own powerless homes to notice anything outside. It wasn't until later that we found out who he was. He lived a few houses down. Not a stranger. Not some drifter wandering through after the storm. He was someone I had seen before. Many times. I had walked past his house every day after school. He was always outside, always watching, always saying hello. I never thought much of it at the time. He was just one of those neighbors, one of those people you saw but never really noticed. And then I remembered something else. When I was younger, I always slept with my curtains open. I had never thought twice about it before. I liked the way the moonlight streamed in through the window. I liked waking up to the sunrise. But after that night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. How many times had he stood outside watching? How many nights had I slept, completely unaware of the eyes on me? I never slept with the curtains open again. The Laguna Salada was supposed to be the perfect place for what we had planned. A vast, dried-out salt flat in Baja California, far away from the city lights, where we could set up our cameras and capture the night sky. It was the kind of place where you could see the Milky Way in its full, raw beauty. No light pollution, just an endless black void scattered with stars. We were a group of graphic design students, all Mexicans, all obsessed with photography, and all excited about finally getting a chance to shoot some proper star trails. The drive was long, but we didn't mind. We joked around, talked about which settings we were going to use, and shared stories about other late-night photography trips. None of us had any idea that this would be the last time we'd ever come to this place. We took an entrance from the highway and drove in about 500 meters, deep into the Laguna Salada. Even with the car's headlights, the landscape felt empty, just cracked salt crust stretching out in every direction. To our left was a patch of dense, tangled bushes, and to our right, an open, flat expanse leading into the darkness. It seemed like the perfect spot. The bushes would block any headlights from passing cars, keeping our photos clean from unwanted light. The first thing we noticed when we stepped out of the car was the sound. It wasn't loud, but it was everywhere. A soft, hissing, rattling noise surrounded us, like dozens of tiny maracas being shaken at different distances, some close, some far. It was strange. None of us had ever heard anything like it before. At first, we threw out theories. Someone said it might be echoes from the highway, bouncing off the salt crust. Another guessed insects, some weird desert species making noise at night. One of us, always the joker, laughed and said, "Alien probes, man." We all chuckled, but there was an uneasiness beneath it. We brushed it off and got to work. Tripod set up, camera positioned, shutter switch ready. We ran some test shots, checked the results, and when everything looked good, we started the long exposure for the star trails. The camera would take care of itself for a while, so we grabbed our lanterns and decided to explore. We walked for about 15 minutes, getting deeper into the flats. The ground beneath us was rough in some places, cracked in others, and sometimes weirdly soft like dried mud. The air was still and dry, carrying only the faintest traces of dust. The silence, aside from that rattling noise in the distance, was unsettling. Then one of my friends suddenly stopped. His voice came out tense, almost shaking. "Two men are coming at us." We laughed. We thought he was messing with us. But he didn't laugh back. His voice came again, dead serious this time. "Not kidding. Two men are coming at us. And they have rifles." That was the moment everything shifted. We turned our heads, and sure enough, two dark figures were moving toward us from the direction we had come. As soon as they were close enough, they shouted, "Turn off the flashlights. Turn them off now." We obeyed immediately. Fear locked up my body like ice. The two men got closer, their rifles raised. My mind was racing. Who the hell were they? Cops? No, that wasn't how cops operated. Military? Unlikely. That only left one possibility: cartel. "Don't move," one of them said. "Keep your hands down. No sudden movements." I could barely breathe. My heartbeat was so loud in my ears that I thought they could hear it too. The way they spoke, the way they moved, it was pure aggression, but controlled, professional. They weren't just some random guys with guns. They were the real deal. They started asking questions, rapid fire, barely giving us time to answer. "Who are you? What are you doing here? How long have you been here? What are your names? How old are you?" We answered everything as calmly as we could, but I could tell they weren't satisfied. They kept whispering to each other, keeping their rifles pointed at us. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I knew they were deciding something. That was when I thought we were going to die. I had never felt anything like it before. I wasn't even thinking in words, just pure raw fear. My brain started flashing through old memories. Christmas mornings, my first girlfriend, my high school graduation. I got angry. This wasn't how I was supposed to die. Not out here, in the middle of nowhere, executed by some cartel sicarios just because we wanted to take some goddamn pictures. Then one of them spoke again. "Go back to your car. Keep taking your photos, but stay away from the bushes." And then, the line that still haunts me. "Rifles tend to misfire in there." We got the message. As we turned and walked away, my entire body was tense, waiting for the gunshots. I could almost feel the bullets tearing through my back. But nothing happened. Somehow, we made it back to the car in one piece. We didn't even speak. We just started grabbing our gear, throwing everything into the car as fast as we could. My hands were shaking so bad that I almost dropped my camera. Then, just as we were about to leave, we heard a sharp, loud rattling sound right next to us. One of my friends turned his flashlight back on. A baby rattlesnake. It was inches from his foot, coiled, head raised, fangs bared, its tail shaking violently. Then suddenly, it all made sense. The sound we had heard when we first arrived. The weird hissing and rattling that had been all around us. It had been rattlesnakes. Dozens of them. All night, we had been surrounded by them, walking through their territory, completely unaware. That was it. We were done. We jumped into the car, slammed the doors, and floored it. Dust kicked up behind us as we sped back to the highway, not stopping, not looking back. We didn't breathe normally again until we saw the city lights in the distance. We never went back to the Laguna Salada. None of us ever even mentioned going back. It wasn't just because of the rattlesnakes. It wasn't just because of the narcos. It was the realization of how close we had come. How thin the line was between a normal night and never making it home again. Some places, no matter how beautiful, just aren't worth the risk. Camping in the African wilderness wasn't something I ever imagined myself doing, let alone with an infant. But in our late 20s, my husband and I were young, adventurous, and more naive than we had any right to be. Teaching in Lesotho had already introduced us to a life far removed from the structured world we had known, and on holidays, we would set off on camping trips across Zimbabwe's vast national parks, eager to explore the wild beauty of Africa. We had no guide, no real knowledge of the dangers we might face, and no proper weapons for protection. Just a tent, some supplies, and a deep sense of wanderlust that blinded us to the risks. Our daughter, barely a year old, was with us. Looking back, I shudder at our ignorance. But at the time, it felt like an adventure, like we were part of something ancient and untamed. The day had been long and hot, the kind of African heat that saps your energy and coats your skin in a layer of dust. We had set up camp in an open area not far from a watering hole, thinking it was a prime spot, close enough to observe wildlife, but not so close as to be in their path. Or so we thought. By sunset, the air had cooled, and the sounds of the wild filled the darkness. The deep grunts of hippos echoed from the water, distant whoops of hyenas rose and fell like laughter on the wind, and the occasional sharp cry of a bird startled the night. We were used to these sounds. They had become part of the background of our travels, a reminder that we were visitors in a land ruled by creatures far older and more adapted to survival than us. Our daughter lay between us in the tent, her small body curled up in sleep, the soft rise and fall of her breathing the only sound inside our thin shelter. We were exhausted from the day, from driving along rough roads and setting up camp under the punishing sun, and despite the unfamiliarity of the land, sleep came quickly. I don't know what woke me first, the distant cough-like sound, or the way my body instinctively tensed before my mind even registered danger. I held my breath, listening. The noise came again, a rough, guttural hacking sound, like someone clearing their throat. But it wasn't a person. At first, I told myself it was nothing. An animal, perhaps, but far enough away not to worry about. Then, through the thin fabric of the tent, I heard movement, soft, deliberate steps, the kind made by something that knew how to move without being noticed. I turned my head towards my husband, but in the pitch black of the tent, I couldn't see him. The only sound inside was our daughter's soft, occasional babbling in her sleep, the innocent noises of a baby in dreams. Outside, the coughing sound came again, but closer this time. Something was out there. The darkness pressed against the tent walls, and I felt the first flicker of true fear settle in my chest. We had no rifle, no knife within reach, no way to protect ourselves if something decided we were prey. I strained to hear, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. Then I caught it, multiple sets of footsteps. Not one animal, but several, circling just beyond the thin barrier of canvas. Hyenas. The realization sent a chill through my body. We had seen them before, slinking through the grasslands in the evening, their backs sloped, their eyes calculating. Scavengers, opportunists, but also killers. A pack could take down prey far larger than us. And now, they were outside our tent. My daughter stirred, her small voice breaking the silence. A soft, high-pitched coo, followed by a little giggle. My stomach twisted. The night had been still before, but now the sounds outside changed. More coughing noises, more movement, more animals closing in. The baby's voice had drawn them. I reached out in the dark, gripping my husband's arm. He was awake. I could feel the tension in his body, the way he held himself completely still. We were both listening, waiting, hoping that if we didn't move, they might lose interest. Then came the sniffing, right up against the tent. A deep, slow inhale, followed by a pause, then another breath. Something was smelling us. No, not us. The baby. The realization hit me like ice water. It wasn't just curiosity. It was hunger. The tent fabric moved slightly as something pressed against it. I felt the outline of a snout pushing against the material, felt the way it tested, exploring the strange object between it and what it wanted. Then came the scraping, a clawed foot digging at the ground near the base of the tent. Not ripping the fabric, not yet. Just testing, searching for a way in. Panic surged through me. We had no defense. If they decided to come in, there was nothing between us and them but a flimsy sheet of canvas. My daughter whimpered, her tiny body shifting against the blankets. The sniffing became more urgent. Something snapped inside me. Before I even thought, before fear could stop me, I pulled back my fist and drove it forward as hard as I could. My knuckles collided with something solid, something wet and bristled with fur. The snout of the hyena. A scream tore through the night. But it wasn't mine. The animal let out a sound unlike anything I had ever heard, high-pitched, shocked, almost human in its intensity. Then chaos. The entire pack erupted into motion, yelping, snarling, crashing into each other as they bolted away from the tent. I heard paws thudding against the ground, heard branches snapping as they ran in blind panic. The coughing calls faded into the distance, swallowed by the vast darkness of the wild. And then silence. I sat frozen, my fists still clenched, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My daughter stirred again, making a small, contented noise, completely unaware of how close she had come to danger. For a long time, we didn't move. The adrenaline coursed through my body, leaving me trembling. Every nerve screamed at me to stay alert, to listen for their return. But they didn't come back. The night stretched on, but I never slept again. By the first light of dawn, we emerged from the tent, stepping cautiously into the golden morning. The ground around our campsite was marked with prints, deep, clawed tracks circling the tent, the dirt near the entrance torn up where they had tried to dig through. But they were gone. We packed up quickly. No coffee, no breakfast, no lingering. As we drove away from that place, the reality of what had happened settled into my bones. We had been stupid, reckless, oblivious to the dangers we had so carelessly walked into. But we had also been lucky. The wild does not give second chances, and that night, we had nearly learned that the hard way. I never camped in the open in Africa again. I was in middle school when it happened. At first, it was just another missing child report, the kind you see on the news with a sad picture and a desperate plea from the parents. But this one was different. It swallowed my town whole. Hundreds of helicopters flew over our houses day and night, their searchlights sweeping through the fields, the forests, the neighborhoods. The sound of their blades was constant, rattling my bedroom window at night and making it impossible to sleep. Every day, I walked to school under that endless droning, watching the sky, knowing they were searching for a little boy who had already been gone for days. The town felt suffocated by it. The grocery stores had flyers taped to every window, his small face looking out at us, his name printed in bold letters beneath it. The morning news talked about nothing else. People I'd never seen before were walking through our streets, volunteers and reporters, their cameras and microphones turning every sidewalk into a stage for speculation. The police searched his mother's house first. They found nothing. No body, no sign of what had happened. But the house itself was something else entirely. The news didn't hold back. They showed the inside of that place, the way the floors were covered in dog and cat shit, the heroin needles scattered across the carpet, the garbage piled so high in the corners that it looked like no one had cleaned in years. The reporters talked about the smell, about the roaches that crawled out when the police turned over the couch cushions. The mother was on TV constantly, crying in every interview, her face blotchy and swollen, her words slurred. People felt bad for her. The town was split. Half of them thought she was a grieving mother who had lost her son. The other half whispered about how she wasn't right in the head, that she probably hadn't been watching him properly, that maybe he wandered off while she was high and now he was dead because of her carelessness. A week passed. The search continued. The helicopters never left. Then she confessed. The news broke in the middle of the school day. We were in class when the announcement came over the intercom, something about an important update, something about parents being notified. The teachers all had that same tight expression, their eyes darting between each other, unsure what to say. When I got home, my mom had the TV on. The news anchor's voice was low and careful, the kind they use when talking about something too horrible to say outright. But the words came anyway. She had beaten him to death. Not just her husband too. The boy had wet the bed, and in their drugged-out haze, they snapped. They hit him over and over, the way you'd hit a dog for misbehaving, except they didn't stop. They kept going until he wasn't breathing anymore. And then, when they realized what they'd done, they stuffed his small body into a garbage bag and carried him outside, past their filthy living room, past the kitchen counters littered with dirty needles and crushed beer cans. They put him in their car and drove in silence through the night, taking the back roads, making sure no one saw them. They buried him in a shallow grave, right next to my middle school. When the police dug him up, it was all over the news again. They found him wrapped in plastic, like trash. The dirt was loose, like it had been rushed. His body was small, too small. The reporters didn't say much about what he looked like after a week underground, but they didn't have to. People talked. Parents didn't want their kids going near that spot anymore. The school went on lockdown for a few days, just to keep the media away, but we all knew. We knew what was just outside those walls, what had been hidden beneath the ground we walked on every day. Some kids started making up stories, saying they'd seen things near the grave at night. But there was nothing supernatural about it. The real horror was that it happened at all. That it took a confession for anyone to find him. That if she had never said anything, his small body would have rotted in that dirt forgotten. That his mother had sat on TV, crying, lying to everyone, playing the victim while he was just a few hundred feet away, buried in the cold earth. The town never really moved on. The search helicopters disappeared, the news vans left, the volunteers went home. But the stain of it never washed away. His mother and her husband were sent to prison. People said she broke down during interrogation, that she spilled everything in a drugged-up haze, that she didn't even try to hide it anymore. The house she had lived in was condemned. No one wanted to buy it. No one even wanted to go near it. And the grave? The city put up a memorial for him. Flowers, candles, a little plaque with his name on it. But it didn't make anything better. It just made it impossible to forget. Every day, we walked past that spot. Every day, we were reminded of the boy who should have been alive. A kid, just 5 years old, beaten to death for wetting the bed. And the worst part, it wasn't even the first time something like that had happened in our town. And it wouldn't be the last. I had never been the type to scare easily. I liked to think I was practical, good at keeping my head clear, even in stressful situations. But all of that changed the day I saw him walk up from my basement. It was the early 90s, and I was living alone in our home in a quiet part of town while my husband was overseas in England. He worked as an arborist, doing tree surgery work, which meant that sometimes he had to travel for weeks at a time. I didn't love being alone in the house, but I was used to it. It was just part of our life. Our house wasn't big, but it was comfortable. A modest 2-story place with a basement, tucked away in a neighborhood where people still left their doors unlocked most of the time. It was the kind of town where you recognized most of your neighbors, even if you didn't know them well. People looked out for each other, but at the same time, everyone mostly kept to themselves. I remember the exact moment it happened because it was so ordinary. I was in the laundry room, standing in front of the washer, folding a pile of warm clothes fresh out of the dryer. The hum of the machines filled the small space, and I wasn't thinking about anything in particular. Just another quiet evening alone. Then I heard it. A sound from behind me. Not a loud crash, not even heavy footsteps. Just the quiet creak of a floorboard, barely audible over the low rumble of the dryer. But it was enough. Enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I turned around, expecting to see something small, something harmless, a shadow, a trick of the light, maybe even a mouse. But instead, there was a man. He was standing at the entrance to the laundry room, halfway up the basement stairs, looking right at me. I froze. My brain refused to make sense of what I was seeing. He wasn't supposed to be here. No one was supposed to be here. I had locked the doors. I was alone. My husband was thousands of miles away. And yet, there he was. My whole body went cold. He was tall, thin but not scrawny, with dark hair and a sharp, angular face. His clothes were plain, nondescript, just jeans and a jacket, the kind of thing any man in town might wear. But there was something about him that immediately felt wrong. Something in the way he stood, too casual, too at ease, as if he had every right to be there. His presence didn't feel like a mistake. He wasn't confused. He wasn't lost. He wasn't delivering a package or looking for help. He was inside my house, and he had come from my basement. I don't remember dropping the shirt I was folding, but suddenly my hands were empty. My voice came out sharper, angrier than I expected. A defense mechanism. I demanded to know what the hell he was doing here. He smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was small, tight, forced, like he was trying to seem harmless, but not quite pulling it off. And then he spoke. He told me he was a friend of my husband's, that he had just stopped by to see if he was home. He said my husband had told him he could just walk in any time. That was a lie. A bold, stupid, obvious lie. My husband wasn't the type to invite people over without telling me. And he sure as hell wouldn't have told anyone, let alone some man I didn't know, to just walk into our house unannounced. My mind was racing. Every instinct in my body screamed at me that this was wrong, that this man wasn't here by accident, that he had been in my basement, that he had let himself in. But I didn't let myself panic. I forced myself to stay calm, to think fast. I told him my husband had just gone out to the store and would be back any minute. I didn't know if he would believe me, but it was the only thing I could think to say. For a second, his expression flickered. Just for a second. It was subtle, but I caught it, the hesitation, the moment where he reconsidered whatever he had been planning to do. Then he nodded, said he'd wait outside, and then he turned and walked out the door. I stood there, frozen, until I heard it close behind him. Then I ran. I grabbed the phone and called the police so fast my hands were shaking. My voice was loud, frantic, words spilling out in a rush as I tried to explain what had just happened. But by the time they arrived, he was gone. They searched the area, checked around the house, even looked through the basement. Nothing. No sign of him. They told me I had done the right thing, that I had been smart not to let him know I was alone. They told me to keep my doors locked, to be careful. That was it. For the next 2 weeks, I barely slept. I kept all the lights on at night. I double-checked the locks so many times I lost count. Every noise, every shadow outside my window made my heart race. I kept thinking about that moment, the way he had walked up from my basement like he belonged there. The way he had lied, so easily, so smoothly. But eventually life went on. The fear didn't go away, but it dulled. Nothing else happened. He didn't come back. And slowly, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, it had been some kind of fluke. Then they caught him. The news broke 2 weeks later. A man had been arrested, a serial killer who had been terrorizing British Columbia. His mugshot was on TV, and I recognized him instantly. It was him, the man from my basement. I sat there, staring at the screen, feeling like the air had been sucked out of the room. My hands were ice cold. My heart was pounding. I had been alone in my house with him. I had spoken to him. He had been in my basement, and I had survived. If I had reacted differently, if I had let my fear show, if I had said the wrong thing, if I had admitted I was alone, maybe I wouldn't have. I never stopped thinking about that moment, about how close I had come to being just another one of his victims, about how sometimes the worst kind of horror isn't a shadow in the dark or a noise in the night. It's a man who smiles at you from your own basement and walks right into your home like he was always meant to be there. I had just turned 20 when it happened. It was 2010. Life wasn't perfect, but I was managing. I had dropped out of college after a year, and though I wasn't exactly where I thought I'd be at this point in life, things were still okay. I had a boyfriend, a few close friends, and my family wasn't far. I spent a lot of time around them, especially one of my younger friends who lived nearby. His name was S. S was someone I had known for a long time, though I never thought of him as particularly close. I knew his family well. 2 of his sisters were friends of mine, even though they didn't know each other. My parents knew S too, so when he asked me to go out riding in his truck, nobody thought much of it. It wasn't something he usually invited me to do, but I had spent enough time around him that it didn't seem unusual. Later, I found out that he had lied to my parents about where I was, telling them I was helping him fix his computer. I wish I had said no. We drove deep into the woods, farther than I realized at the time. The dirt roads were rough, full of potholes and deep ruts from where trucks had carved through the mud. The air smelled like wet earth, thick with the scent of pine and stagnant water from the low-lying areas. The truck lurched and swayed as we hit every uneven patch, but S seemed at home on these roads, taking sharp turns without hesitation. At first, I thought it was just a normal ride. The sun was beginning to sink lower in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. We had gone miles off the main road, bouncing through the back trails where only locals knew the way. The forest stretched out in all directions, endless and swallowing. There were no houses out here, no lights, nothing but thick brush and narrow dirt paths. And then he propositioned me. I remember how sudden it was, the way his voice cut through the hum of the engine and the crunch of gravel under the tires. I turned to look at him, trying to process if he was serious or if this was some kind of terrible joke. But there was no humor in his face. I told him no. I was in a relationship, and I was loyal. He didn't argue. He didn't say anything else. He just kept driving, his face unreadable, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. We kept going. The trees grew denser. The sun dipped lower. Then, somewhere deep in that vast emptiness, the truck sputtered and died. We were stranded. S acted surprised, as if he hadn't expected the truck to run out of gas. But I felt it in my gut. This wasn't an accident. He hadn't planned on going back anytime soon. The truck sat in the middle of the trail, useless, while the reality of the situation sank in. We were 16 miles into the woods, and it was nearly dark. I stepped out of the truck, feeling the ground squelch beneath my shoes. The mud was thick, pulling at my feet as I tried to walk. Each step made an awful sucking sound, and soon I felt the cold wetness seep into my shoes. I was getting frustrated, my pulse quickening with the rising panic in my chest. I wanted to leave. I wanted to get out of there. Then it happened. S grabbed me. I fought. I tried to push him off, to get away, but he was stronger. The ground was wet and uneven, and my feet slipped. I went down hard, hitting the dirt, the damp earth pressing into my skin. His weight pinned me there. I struggled, gasping for air, my body screaming in protest as he held me down. The trees swayed above me, the last light of the day filtering through the leaves in streaks of orange and gold. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called out, oblivious to what was happening. And then it was over. The pain was immediate, sharp and deep. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. My mind felt like it had been shattered into pieces, scattered across the forest floor like broken glass. The damp earth clung to my skin, mixing with blood. Es got up. He didn't say anything. He just moved away, as if nothing had happened. I lay there, staring up at the darkening sky, trying to process what had just been stolen from me. The air smelled of sweat and damp soil, the scent forever burned into my memory. My body felt broken, my limbs numb and disconnected from me. And then the worst part, he left me there. He said he was going to get help, that he'd come back with someone to take me out of there. But even in my broken state, I knew he wasn't coming back. The night swallowed the forest in complete darkness. The only sounds were the distant calls of unseen animals and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. My body ached. My feet were bare, my shoes lost somewhere in the mud. I had no food, no water, and I was still bleeding heavily. At some point, I forced myself to move. I found an old soda bottle, half buried in the dirt, and took it to the nearby creek. The water was murky, but I was desperate. I drank. It tasted like earth and decay, but I swallowed it down, ignoring the burning in my throat. The sun rose, blistering and unforgiving. My skin burned, my head throbbed, and panic took root in my chest. I was alone. I started walking. The ground beneath my feet was brutal. Sharp stones, jagged shale, and dry, cracked dirt that radiated heat like a furnace. My soles burned, but I kept going. Every step was agony, but I had no choice. The old train tunnel wasn't far now. If I could make it there, I'd be closer to the tracks. Maybe someone would hear me. When I reached the tunnel, I collapsed. I screamed for help. My voice echoed against the stone walls, bouncing back at me. I screamed until my throat was raw, until my breath came in ragged gasps. I thought I heard my name in the distance, but no one answered when I called back. I thought I heard a train. I forced myself to stand, broken and bleeding, ready to flag it down. But before I could, headlights cut through the trees. 10 cars. I froze, panic gripping me. Then a figure stepped out, an EMT. He touched my arm, and I broke. I wasn't imagining it. This was real. I had been found. I later learned my family had gone looking for me. They had gone to S's house, demanding answers. My cousin had threatened him, my mother had begged him, and finally, he gave up my location. But the strangest part? At 5 a.m. that morning, before I was found, my mother got a text. It said, "Help me." There was no number, no sender. It disappeared when she tried to call back. I should have died out there. But I didn't, and I still don't know why. I was 9 years old when I first understood what real fear felt like. Not the kind that comes from ghost stories whispered under a blanket or the jolt of a jump scare in a movie, but the kind that sticks with you long after the danger is gone. The kind that makes you check the locks twice at night, that makes you glance over your shoulder even in broad daylight. The kind that reminds you how small you are in a world where some people mean you harm. My best friend lived next door. Technically, she had been my first friend in this world, born just 3 weeks before me. Our mothers had been close, and from the moment we could walk, we had been inseparable. We spent nearly every day together, along with my younger sister, who at that age followed us everywhere. Our houses were separated by an old wooden fence, but it had seen better days. The planks were warped, riddled with splinters, and missing in places where time had eaten away at them. Eventually, my dad got tired of fixing it and decided to take it down completely, leaving nothing but an open stretch of grass between our yards. It made playing outside easier. We no longer had to run around the fence to fetch stray balls or shout over the wooden barrier to talk. It felt like we had one giant shared backyard, and in a way, it made our little world feel safer. That day was like any other. The air was warm, the sun high, and the three of us were playing volleyball where the fence used to stand. The ball would go up, we'd chase it down laughing, calling out to each other as we smacked it back and forth. We weren't thinking about anything else, Certainly not about cars or strangers or what dangers might be watching. But I noticed the car. It was a tan sedan, nothing special about it. But something felt off. The first time it passed, I didn't think much of it. Our street wasn't busy, but cars came and went, people driving home or heading to the store. The second time, I started to pay attention. The same car moving slower. It wasn't just passing through. By the third time, I knew something was wrong. It wasn't just the fact that the car had circled the block 3 times. It was the way it moved, the way it braked just in front of our yards, lingering there. And then, the driver leaned over, almost into the empty passenger seat, just staring at us. I felt a tightness in my chest, something I didn't have a name for back then, but now I know it was instinct. A feeling that something wasn't right, something wasn't safe. I hesitated for a moment, watching the car speed off again before I turned and ran inside. My mom was in the kitchen, and I told her what I saw. She thanked me, her voice calm, and told me I could go back outside. But she moved from the kitchen to the living room, where the big picture window overlooked the yard. She wasn't just dismissing me. She was watching. I went back outside, the unease still sitting heavy in my stomach. But my friends were still playing, still laughing, still unaware. I picked up the ball and forced myself to focus. And then he came back. A fourth time. This time, he didn't just slow down. He stopped. The car rolled to a halt in the middle of the street, the passenger door swinging open. He got out. He wasn't tall, but he wasn't short either. He wasn't old, but he wasn't young. He looked like someone's dad, dressed in jeans and a plain t-shirt, his hair unkempt. There was nothing particularly frightening about his appearance, but the way he moved, the slow, deliberate steps toward us, made my blood turn cold. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at my sister. He looked straight at my best friend. He said something, but I couldn't hear it. His voice was low, almost a mumble, and she took a step closer. So did he. She hesitated. "What?" she asked, but before she could take another step, my mom was already running. I didn't even hear the front door open, didn't hear her feet pound against the pavement. One moment, it was just us and the man. The next, my mother was there, her voice a roar of fury I had never heard before. She didn't just yell at him. She charged him. I had never seen her like that. The man jerked back, startled, stumbling over his own feet. He hesitated for a second too long, as if debating whether to argue, but then he turned and bolted for his car. My mom wasn't stopping. She was after him, screaming at the top of her lungs, cursing him, telling him to get the hell out of our neighborhood. I watched, frozen, as he scrambled into the driver's seat, the tires screeching as he peeled away. My mom didn't stop there. She was already dialing 911. Even as she paced, even as she kept her eyes locked on the direction he had gone, her fingers worked the phone, reporting everything. She didn't even glance at us. She didn't ask if we were okay. She already knew we weren't. We went inside. My best friend's parents were called. The police came, and that's when we learned the truth. The man wasn't just some creep. He wasn't just a stranger with bad intentions. He was a registered sex offender. He had been circling the neighborhood for days, not just watching us, but other kids, other streets, other yards, waiting. The police found him. Maybe it was my mom's quick thinking, or maybe he had already been on their radar, but they caught him. And that should have been the end of it. But it wasn't, because even after he was gone, even after we knew he wouldn't be coming back, something had changed. We weren't just kids playing in the yard anymore. We were kids who had seen something, who had felt something we shouldn't have had to feel. We knew now that danger wasn't just something in movies or whispered warnings. It was real. It had been right there, in our neighborhood, on our street, and it had been looking right at us. After that, we didn't play outside as freely. We stuck closer together. We paid attention to cars, to people, to eyes that lingered too long. And I learned something that day, something that has never left me. When something feels wrong, it probably is. And sometimes, the only thing standing between you and the worst day of your life is someone who listens. I grew up in the mountains, the deep Rockies, to be exact. My parents owned a stretch of land, 35 acres of untouched wilderness, about 2 or 3 hours from our home. It wasn't a cabin or a house, just land, and we treated it as our own private campsite. We spent as much time there as we could, especially in the summer, packing up our tents, coolers, and whatever else we needed and driving out into the middle of nowhere to stay for days at a time. It was beautiful, it was quiet, and most of all, it was ours. No tourists, no crowds, no rules. Just endless pine forests, rocky ridges, and the kind of silence you only find that far out in the wild. My parents had both grown up in the mountains and knew what they were doing. They had camped, backpacked, hunted, and fished for most of their lives. My dad had a quiet confidence about him when it came to the outdoors. He was the type to scare off a bear rather than run from it. My mom was the same. She had a camera that she always carried with her, and if she saw a bear or a mountain lion, she'd follow it, hoping to get the perfect shot. She wasn't reckless, just fearless in a way I never was. My little brother and I had grown up under their watch, learning from them, and by the time I was old enough to remember things clearly, I knew the basics of survival, how to identify animal tracks, and how to listen to the forest. That was the biggest thing, listening, The forest always had something to say. That's what made that night so strange. We arrived late, later than usual. It was already dark when we pulled off the highway onto the dirt road that led to our property. I remember watching the headlights carve through the trees as we bounced over the rough track, the outline of the tall pines flashing past in the high beams. It had been a long drive, and we were all tired, but we still had to set up camp. I climbed out of the car, stretching my legs, and that's when I felt it for the first time. Something was wrong. It wasn't anything obvious, not at first. Just off. The air felt thick, heavy in a way it shouldn't have. It was a cool summer night, but the air pressed in on me, like walking into a room where something terrible had just happened. I looked at my mom, and she was standing still listening. My dad too. Even the dogs, who usually bounded out of the car, were hesitant. It was silent. Not just quiet. Silent. No crickets. No owls. No rustling in the underbrush. Not even the faint hum of wind through the trees. It was a dead, unnatural silence, the kind that makes your instincts light up with warning. I'd never heard the forest like that before. I wasn't the only one who noticed. My mom gave a nervous laugh, and my dad muttered something under his breath. But we went about setting up camp. What else were we supposed to do? We were exhausted, and it was too late to turn back. We picked a spot near the clearing where we usually camped and started unloading the car. The whole time, I kept looking around, feeling that pressure in my chest, that sense of being watched. But from where? From everywhere. We got the tent up quickly, working on autopilot, but the feeling never left. If anything, it got worse. Then the noises started. At first, I thought it was the wind shifting through the trees, but there was no wind. The air was completely still. It was something in the trees. The rustling came from up high, not from the ground. Something moving through the branches. Not just one thing. Many. It wasn't the sharp, precise movement of squirrels or birds. It was heavier, clumsier, like something big jumping from branch to branch. More than one. I froze. My dad turned, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just trees. The noise grew louder, closer. It was surrounding us. Branches creaked under the weight of whatever was up there. I could hear twigs snapping, leaves rustling, the occasional thud of something landing hard on a thick branch before moving again. Then came the sounds. I have spent my entire life in the woods. I know the calls of almost every animal in the region. I know what a mountain lion sounds like. I know the eerie scream of a fox. I know the strange, almost human-like laughter of coyotes. This wasn't any of those. It started as a hooting sound, almost like an owl, but too deep, too guttural. Then another answered, and another, and another. Within seconds, the forest was alive with them. A chorus of calls, some high-pitched, some low, all of them wrong. They echoed from every direction, overlapping, repeating, growing louder and more erratic. Some were long and drawn out, others short and clipped, like a garbled attempt at speech. They almost sounded human, like a person trying to mimic an animal, but not quite getting it right. I was shaking. The dogs were huddled against my mom, ears flat, their bodies pressed low to the ground. I had never seen them that scared before, not even when they'd been face-to-face with a bear. My dad grabbed his flashlight and stepped toward the trees. The moment he did, the sound stopped. Dead silence again. The oppressive weight lifted, just like that. He scanned the trees, his beam cutting through the branches, but there was nothing there. Just stillness. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. My parents exchanged a glance, and without a word, we all moved quickly toward the tent. My brother and I were shoved inside first, the dogs crawling in after us. My mom and dad followed, zipping the flap tight. We sat there, huddled together, listening. For a long time, there was nothing, just the suffocating quiet. Then a single sound. Not from the trees this time, from above. Something was on top of the tent. It was subtle, barely audible, but I heard it, the faintest sound of fabric shifting, like something pressing down just slightly. I held my breath, waiting. Then, as fast as it had come, it was gone. And just like that, the forest was normal again. Crickets started chirping. A night hawk screeched in the distance. The trees rustled gently with the wind. My dad unzipped the tent and stepped outside. My mom followed. After a long moment, I forced myself to peek out too. Nothing. No tracks. No broken branches. Just the empty, quiet woods. We stayed for 2 more nights. Nothing else happened. But none of us ever felt the same there again. We went back to that property every summer for years after that. And though we had other strange encounters, bears, mountain lions, even a moose that wandered into our camp, nothing ever came close to that night. We still talk about it, trying to explain it, but we never can. And to this day, when I think about that night, I find myself looking up, watching the trees, listening, just in case. I don't believe in supernatural things. I never have. I've never seen a ghost, never thought I was being followed by something invisible, never had any unexplainable feelings of being watched. If a door slams, it's the wind. If I hear a noise at night, it's just the house settling. If something doesn't make sense right away, I assume there's a reason. I just haven't figured it out yet. That's how I've always thought about things. Everything has a logical explanation. But that one day, when my dogs disappeared and reappeared out of nowhere, I still can't explain it. And I've tried. That day was like any other. My mom and I were going out for lunch, and before we left, she reminded me to let the dogs outside. That was routine. We had 2 dogs, one big, one medium-sized. The bigger one was around 100 pounds, bulky and strong, built like a pit mix but with a softer face. The other one was about 50 pounds, a little more skittish, but they were both good dogs. Smart, too. I walked to the back door, unlatched it, and pushed it open. The dogs ran past me, out into the yard. The sun was out, and there was a little breeze, just enough to rustle the trees in the back. I stood there for a second, watching them sniff around, and then I shut the door, making sure it latched all the way. That was it. I didn't think twice about it. My mom and I were gone for about an hour. We got back, pulled into the driveway, and walked up to the house. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Usually, when we came home, the dogs would hear the car, and by the time we were at the front door, they'd be at the fence, tails wagging, waiting for us to let them in. But this time, nothing. I walked to the back door, looked outside, and saw nothing. No dogs. Maybe they were in the yard, just out of sight. It was a big yard, 6-foot privacy fence all around, a couple of sheds, some trees, and an area we called the squirrel yard. They could be anywhere. I stepped outside, whistled, and called for them. Nothing. I walked the yard, checking behind the sheds, looking in all their usual spots. Still nothing. Now I was starting to second-guess myself. Did I actually let them out? Maybe I just thought I did. Maybe they were inside the whole time. I went back inside and checked every room. It wasn't a big house, 1 story, about 1,000 square feet, so it didn't take long to look. I checked the living room, the kitchen, the bedrooms, the bathroom. I even looked in closets, under beds, behind furniture, just in case. Nothing. By now, my mom was helping me search. She was starting to get nervous, and so was I. If they weren't inside, and they weren't in the yard, then where were they? The only explanation was that they got out somehow. We went back into the yard and checked the fence. It was 6 feet tall, made of solid wood, with no gaps between the planks. There was no way they could have jumped it. Our big dog was strong, but he wasn't a jumper. So maybe they dug underneath? We walked the perimeter, looking for holes. Nothing. No fresh dirt, no disturbed ground. Okay, maybe someone stole them? It was possible, but how? The gate was padlocked. The only way in or out of the yard was either through the house or over the fence. If someone took them, they would have had to climb over, grab 2 full-grown dogs, and then lift them back over a 6-foot fence. That didn't make sense either. At this point, we were completely stumped. No holes under the fence. No way they could have climbed over. No signs of a break-in. No possible way they could be inside the house without us seeing them. They were just gone. We started walking around the neighborhood, calling their names, checking alleyways, peering into other people's yards, looking for any sign of them. I checked the ditches, the wooded area down the street, even the road, just in case something awful had happened. Nothing. We walked and walked, asking neighbors if they had seen anything. Nobody had. 2 hours passed. It didn't make any sense. I was trying to think of anything, anything, that could explain how 2 big dogs disappeared from a locked yard with no way out. By now, I was exhausted. My legs hurt from walking, my throat was dry from calling their names, and I felt completely drained. We decided to go back home, regroup, and figure out what to do next. I was so desperate for an answer that I even crawled into the crawl space under the house. I took the grate off, slid under, and shined a flashlight around. Nothing. They were just gone. We were out for 3 hours in total, searching, calling, knocking on doors. When we finally got back, I was so frustrated I was ready to tear the yard apart looking for any clue. I was just about to go back into the crawl space again when I heard my mom yell my name from inside the house. I ran inside, and there they were, lying in their beds, sound asleep, like nothing had happened. My heart was pounding. I stood there, just staring. I checked everything. The doors were still locked. The windows were still shut. There was no way anyone had come in while we were gone. And yet, there they were, just there, like they had never left. I crouched down and touched them. They were warm, calm, therefore normal. Not dirty, not wet, not out of breath, no signs of stress. I expected at least our smaller dog to be anxious. He got nervous over the smallest things, but he was fine, perfectly fine. I ran my hands over them, checking for anything unusual. Nothing. They had been gone, and now they were back. I didn't sleep well that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, going over everything again and again. I knew I let them outside. I remembered watching them run into the yard. I checked every possible place they could have hidden. I searched for any possible way they could have escaped. And then somehow they were back, exactly where they were supposed to be. The next morning, I checked the whole house again. I checked the yard, the fence, the locks, everything. Still nothing. No clues. No answers. They were just gone, and then they weren't. I never figured it out, and I probably never will. The drive to North Georgia felt like freedom. The kind of freedom that came with an open road, a truck full of gear, and 5 people who had nothing to do for the next 5 days except enjoy themselves in the woods. The air outside was crisp, just cool enough to make hiking bearable, but not so cold that we'd have to bundle up at night. It was late autumn, and the trees were still hanging on to the last of their leaves, a mix of oranges and deep reds. We parked the truck in a small town, double-checking our packs before setting off. My buddy, the one who had served in the army, had made sure we had everything we needed. He and I both had some experience outdoors, camping, hiking, hunting. The others, not so much. But we had enough gear to make things comfortable. A 10-person tent for 5 people. A propane stove and grill. A fold-up cot for anyone who didn't want to sleep directly on the ground. Even a portable shower. The first few miles were easy. The terrain wasn't too steep, and the trail was well-worn. The deeper we got, the quieter it became. Not in a bad way, just peaceful. The usual sounds of the woods were all around us. Birds calling, squirrels rustling through the leaves, the occasional snap of a branch from something moving in the distance. It felt good to be away from everything. No cell service, no traffic, just trees stretching out in every direction. We had covered about 4 or 5 miles when things changed. The trail opened into a clearing with a small pond in the middle, almost like a tiny lake. It looked untouched, perfectly still, like a mirror reflecting the trees around it. The second we stepped into the clearing, everything stopped. No birds, no wind, not even the sound of our own footsteps seemed to belong. It was like stepping into a vacuum. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. My buddy must have felt it too, because we both slowed down and reached for our sidearms at the same time. In Georgia, it's not unusual for people to carry, especially out in the woods. I'd never seen a bear in this part of the state, but mountain lions and coyotes were possible. He grabbed my arm and nodded toward the opposite tree line. A woman stood there, right at the edge where the trees met the clearing. She was far enough away that I couldn't make out her features, but close enough that I knew she was watching us. She didn't move, didn't shift her weight, just stood there like she had been waiting for us. I looked at my buddy, trying to gauge his reaction, but he didn't say anything. We weren't about to walk over and ask what she was doing there. It was possible she lived nearby. Some people had cabins or off-grid homes deep in the woods, but she was alone. No backpack, no visible gear. We moved past the clearing without a word. Once we were back under the trees, the sounds of the forest returned all at once. Birds, wind, the rustling of leaves, like someone had flipped a switch. We set up camp 2 miles past the clearing, far enough that we didn't feel uneasy anymore. The sun was dipping below the trees by the time we got everything unpacked. We built a fire, cooked some food, and cracked open a few beers. The girls were in good spirits, laughing and joking. My buddy and I didn't bring up what we saw. No reason to make them nervous. Later that night, I snuck off with the girl I had been flirting with. We made some excuse about adjusting the tent, but we both knew what we were really doing. Things were going well, until she suddenly pulled back and looked at me strangely. It was quiet, not just the normal nighttime quiet, not the kind where the wind dies down or the fire crackles softly. This was absolute silence. No crickets, no distant owls, nothing. She got dressed quickly, and we stepped out of the tent, but the others didn't seem to notice anything strange. They teased us about how long it took to fix the tent, and we played along. Maybe it was just our imagination. The next morning, we found the propane stove had been turned on during the night. The tank was empty. No one had touched it. We wrote it off as a mistake. Maybe one of us hadn't turned the knob all the way off. Annoying, but not a big deal. We had enough supplies. The second morning, we noticed small things missing. A lantern we had left outside. A sweatshirt one of the girls had draped over a folding chair. It didn't make sense. There was no sign of an animal rummaging through our stuff, and we were deep enough in the woods that it was unlikely another person had come through. That afternoon, we went looking for a waterfall we had read about. The hike followed a river upstream, the water cutting through the rocks in a steady, calming rhythm. The girls were chatting ahead of us, my buddy and I walking a little behind them. Then the forest went silent again. My buddy nudged me and tilted his head toward the hill on our right. Through the trees, I saw her again. Same woman, same clothes, standing perfectly still, halfway up the slope. She wasn't moving toward us, just watching. I felt my stomach drop. My buddy whispered something about scaring off a mountain lion and took off up the hill, making as much noise as possible. I watched him disappear into the trees. A few minutes later, he came back down and said it was gone. But he told me later that when he got up there, she wasn't anywhere in sight. We made it to the waterfall, tried to shake it off. The girls decided to go skinny dipping, and for a little while, everything felt normal again. We laughed. We took turns jumping into the cold water. Then we hiked back to camp. It was a mess. Not destroyed, but clearly rummaged through. Some of our bags had been moved. A few things were scattered around the fire pit. We told the girls it was probably raccoons. My buddy and I didn't believe that. That night, I woke up to my crush gripping my arm. I opened my eyes, and she put a finger to her lips. I could hear my own heartbeat. Nothing else. Across the tent, my buddy was awake too. Sitting up, listening. The silence stretched. Seconds. Minutes. I didn't dare move. My eyes adjusted to the dark, and I could see shadows shifting outside the tent. Maybe just the fire flickering, except the fire had died down hours ago. None of us slept after that. As soon as the sun started coming up, we packed everything in record time. The entire hike back felt wrong, like we were being watched. The silence followed us. No birds, no wind, just the crunch of our footsteps on the trail. I thought I saw movement in the trees a few times, but never clear enough to be sure. We avoided the lake. When we got to the truck, we didn't waste any time loading up and getting out of there. It wasn't until we were safely on the road that everyone started talking. One by one, the others admitted that they had seen or heard the woman at different points throughout the trip, but had been too freaked out to say anything. The strangest part, none of us could describe her face. It was like it had been blurry, like our eyes refused to focus on it. I haven't been camping since. I used to work at a Boy Scout summer camp deep in the woods. It was the kind of place where the outside world felt distant, where the only sounds at night were the rustling of leaves the chirping of crickets, and the occasional call of an owl. The camp was about 20 miles from the nearest town, nothing but dense forest in between. No paved roads, no power lines stretching out in the distance, just trees and hills rolling endlessly in every direction. Every week, as part of the camp's wilderness survival program, I had to take a group of campers to a secluded spot about half a mile away from the main camp. There, they had to build their own shelters using nothing but sticks, leaves, and whatever else they could find. It was a requirement for their wilderness survival badge, an overnight challenge meant to test their ability to rough it in the wild. The spot we used wasn't far from camp, but we always took them on a winding, indirect route to make it feel more isolated. By the time we got there, the boys always felt like they were miles deep in the woods, completely cut off from civilization. It helped make the experience more authentic. That night started like every other. The campers built their shelters as the sun started dipping behind the trees, the golden light casting long shadows over the forest floor. Some of them worked quickly, piling up branches and leaves into rough A-frames, while others struggled, snapping twigs and complaining that their shelters weren't staying up. I walked around, checking their work, giving pointers where I could. Once they were done, we built a fire in the center of camp and cooked dinner. Hot dogs roasted on sticks, baked beans warmed up in a pot, and some foil-wrapped potatoes thrown into the coals. It was a warm night, the air thick with the scent of pine and smoke. The fire crackled, embers drifting up into the dark sky. The boys talked and laughed, some telling ghost stories, others flicking their flashlights into the woods and daring each other to go out into the trees alone. I let them have their fun for a while, but as it got later, I started rounding them up, sending them off to their shelters. By 11 p.m., the fire had burned down to glowing coals, and the forest had settled into that deep, heavy quiet that only comes late at night. I sat near the remains of the fire with a couple of the other staffers, staring into the embers, enjoying the silence. And then we heard it, faint at first, so quiet I almost thought I imagined it. A distant sound, drifting through the trees, barely more than a whisper against the wind. It took me a few seconds to place it. Bells. Church bells. They were slow and deliberate, ringing once every 30 seconds or so. The sound was eerie, muffled by the trees but unmistakable. We sat there, frozen, listening. None of us said a word, but I could tell by the way the others were looking around that they heard it too. I tried to think of a reasonable explanation. Maybe someone had brought a bell to camp as some kind of joke. Maybe it was a recording, someone playing a prank. But as I turned my head, trying to pinpoint the direction, I realized something that made my stomach clench. There were no churches anywhere near us. The nearest town was at least 20 miles away, and there were no buildings, no cabins, no old houses out in these woods. Just endless trees. The bells kept ringing. Slow, steady, relentless. The campers were starting to stir. A few of them had poked their heads out of their shelters, eyes wide. Some of the younger ones looked scared. I forced myself to stay calm, standing up and dusting off my pants. "It's nothing," I said, keeping my voice low but firm. "Just a late-night church service back at camp." It wasn't a great lie, but it was better than admitting that I had no idea what was going on. The last thing I needed was a bunch of scared kids freaking out in the middle of the woods. The bells continued for another half hour. Every 30 seconds, another slow, deep chime echoing through the trees. It felt endless. Then, just as suddenly as they started, they stopped. Silence. For a few minutes, I thought that was the end of it. I let out a slow breath, feeling my muscles relax. Whatever it had been, it was over. Then, from the same direction, something else started. Singing. Low at first, a murmur in the distance. Then rising, getting louder, until it became a full chorus of voices. I couldn't make out the words, but it had the rhythm of a church hymn. The kind of melody you'd hear in an old country chapel, voices swelling in unison, carrying through the night. But there was something off about it. It wasn't just a few voices. It was dozens, maybe more. And they weren't just singing, they were singing loudly, with this eerie, feverish enthusiasm. Like a congregation completely lost in the music, oblivious to everything else. The campers were terrified now. Some of them were whispering to each other, others staring wide-eyed in the direction of the sound. One of the staffers, a guy named Chris, gave me a nervous look. The singing rose and fell. Sometimes it faded until it was barely audible, just a soft hum in the night. Other times it swelled so loudly that I swore it was getting closer. We sat there listening, waiting for it to end. But it didn't. The minutes dragged by. Midnight passed. Then 12:30. The singing continued. I kept up the lie, telling the campers it was just a special church service back at camp, that nothing was wrong. But in my head, I was trying to figure out what to do. If it was some kind of gathering out in the woods, I didn't want to risk running into it. We were isolated out here. No cell service, no quick way to get back to camp. The safest thing to do was to stay put. So we waited. The singing went on until almost 1 a.m. Then finally it faded. The voices grew softer and softer until at last, there was nothing but the rustling of the wind in the trees. None of us slept much that night. By morning, everything felt normal again. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and the campers almost acted like nothing had happened. I kept up the lie, pretending it was just a weird coincidence. But a few days later, I found out the truth. One of the senior staff members at camp pulled me aside, asked if we'd heard anything strange that night. I told him we had. He nodded, looking grim. There was a KKK rally a few miles from here that night, he said. I felt a cold chill run through me. That's what we had heard. The bells, the singing. It hadn't been a church service. It had been something else entirely. For the rest of the summer, I couldn't stop thinking about it. About how close we had been to something we had no business being near. About what might have happened if we had run into them in the woods. And even now, years later, I still remember sitting there in the dark, listening to those voices drifting through the trees, wondering who, or what was out there. I was there. I saw it all. I remember the way the sun burned high in the sky that afternoon, a cruel, indifferent thing watching over the horror that men were about to commit. The air was thick with heat, sticky with the scent of pine and sweat, but none of us could move. We were frozen in place, held by something deeper than fear. It had started 2 days before, with the killing of Hampton Smith. He was a man who had made enemies, even among his own kind. I had seen him beat his workers, heard the sound of the whip cracking, the dull thud of fists against flesh. He was the kind of man who would rather see a man broken than let him go free. Sidney Johnson killed him. That's what we heard. An 18-year-old black boy, tired of being worked and beaten like an animal, had picked up a gun and shot him. That was all it took. That one act sent everything into motion, like a lit match falling into dry grass. The white men were looking for blood. They didn't care who. They weren't looking for justice. They wanted someone to hang, someone to burn. And they found them. The first few bodies turned up fast, black men, found hanging from trees, shot full of holes, faces unrecognizable. We kept our heads down, mouths shut. It wasn't safe to speak. It wasn't safe to ask who had been taken. Then they came for Hayes Turner. They took him right from the jail, walked him right out in broad daylight, like they had every right. No one stopped them. No one even tried. The sheriff looked the other way. The law was not meant for men like him. I didn't see what they did to him. I only heard about it later, in whispers and hushed voices. He had been strung up by his neck, his body swinging from a tree, left there as a warning. But that wasn't enough for them. They shot him, dozens of times, made sure he was dead, made sure he couldn't speak out against them. And Mary didn't run. She didn't hide. She didn't stay quiet. She had always been strong, the kind of woman who looked you in the eye when she spoke. She wasn't one to let a man walk over her, not even a white man. I had seen her before, standing tall beside her husband, her belly round with their unborn child. There had been something fierce in the way she carried herself, something unbreakable. But they broke her. I heard what she had said, that she would get the men who killed her husband arrested, that they would pay for what they had done. It was foolish to say it, but I understood. What kind of wife wouldn't want to see justice for her husband? But justice wasn't meant for people like us. They found her trying to flee. She had almost made it out, almost slipped away, but they caught her, dragged her back. I was there when they brought her to the bridge. We all were. They tied her up, hung her upside down from a tree. Her dress fell over her head, her swollen stomach exposed. She kicked and thrashed, but there was nothing she could do. They laughed. They doused her in gasoline, the smell sharp and sickening. Someone struck a match, held it in the air for a moment like they were savoring it. Then they touched it to her skin. The fire crawled up her body, blackening her skin, eating her alive. She screamed. The sound cut through me, through all of us. But it wasn't enough for them. A man stepped forward, his face twisted with something that looked like rage, but I knew better. He had a knife in his hand. He sliced her open, right down the middle. Her insides spilled out, and with them her baby. A tiny, helpless thing. It hit the ground, slick with blood and fluids. For a moment, there was silence. Then the baby cried. The man stepped forward again, lifted his boot, and stomped down hard. The crying stopped. I turned away, while rising in my throat, but I couldn't move. None of us could. They shot her body full of holes after that. Left her hanging, burned and broken, her child crushed in the dirt beneath her. When they finally cut her down, they buried her right there, near the base of the tree. No coffin, no marker, just a whiskey bottle stuck in the dirt. And then they left. We stood there for a long time, not speaking, not moving. There was nothing to say. The sun had dipped lower in the sky, the light casting long shadows over the field. The smell of burnt flesh still lingered in the air. The next morning, people began to leave, packing up what little they had, taking their families and fleeing. It wasn't safe anymore. It had never been safe, but now we knew for sure. If they could do that to a pregnant woman, there was nothing they wouldn't do. And so we ran. Some of us made it out. Some didn't. I stayed long enough to see the grave one last time. The bottle was still there, glinting in the sunlight. No name, no words, just a piece of glass marking the place where they had ended her life, where they had ended 2 lives. I don't know why I'm writing this down now. Maybe so I don't forget. Maybe so someone else will remember. Because I was there. I saw it all. And I will never forget. I spend most of my summers outdoors. Through hiking, climbing, sleeping under the stars. No tent, just the sky and the land around me. I do this partly because I love it, but also because I trust the wilderness more than I trust people. Animals are predictable. A bear isn't going to pretend to be friendly and then try to stab you in your sleep. A wild hog won't make small talk just to figure out if you're alone. Nature is dangerous, but it doesn't lie. People do. That's why I prefer camping deep in the woods, away from roads, away from trails, away from the kind of people who wander too close to civilization, but not close enough to be accountable. Every now and then, though, I end up somewhere more accessible, and that's when things get unsettling. 2 times, in particular, have stuck with me. This was one of those rare trips where we actually used tents. It wasn't a serious hike, more of a casual get-together with my classmates at a lake not too far from the city. The kind of trip where we bring beer and sit around a fire instead of pushing through mountain passes with nothing but dehydrated food in our packs. The sun had set, and we needed more firewood to keep things going through the night. I volunteered, along with a friend. The forest was just beyond the edge of our campsite, and as we walked toward it, we noticed another tent, pitched just out of sight from where we were staying. It wasn't a cheap, last-minute setup either. This guy had been here for a while. As we passed, the tent's flap unzipped, and a man stepped out. He was older than us, maybe mid-30s, dressed for long-term camping. He looked normal enough, friendly even. We made small talk, mentioning that we were just grabbing some wood for our fire. He told us he was just out there camping, taking photos of the sunrise, that sort of thing. Then he suggested we split up. There were 2 trails leading into the woods, and he said we'd find more wood that way. It made sense at the time. My friend took the high trail, which ran parallel to mine, and I went lower down. He could still see me, and I could hear him moving above me. A few minutes in, I heard him call my name. There was something in his voice, something off. I turned around, and that's when I saw him, the man from the tent. He was on my trail, about 10 meters behind me, moving fast. He had a machete in his hand. I froze for a second, my brain scrambling to make sense of it. Then he spoke. He said that after we left, he realized we didn't have an axe or a saw, so he thought he'd help us out. Help. With a machete. In the dark. Alone. I forced a polite smile, muttered something about not needing any help, and backed away. My friend was already coming down toward me. Neither of us ran, but we walked fast, straight back to camp. We barely grabbed any wood. Everyone made fun of us when we got back. "What, are you scared of some guy camping?" They laughed. He was probably just being nice. I didn't care. Something was wrong with him. An hour passed. We drank, we talked, and the weirdness of the moment faded, until we saw a headlamp bobbing in the darkness, coming toward our sight. It was him. He was carrying a load of wood in his arms. He set it down near the fire, saying he figured we didn't get enough. Then he walked around our site, too slow, looking too much, checking our tents, asking if this was all of us, if anyone else was coming. No one laughed anymore. He left after a long, uncomfortable silence. That night, no one slept. We took turns staying up, watching. We saw flashes from his campsite, maybe from a flashlight, maybe from binoculars. By dawn, we were done. We packed up and left, 2 hours of restless sleep between all of us. Maybe he was just strange. Maybe he was waiting for us to sleep. Maybe he was planning something worse. I'll never know. But I do know this. I'd rather wake up to a bear sniffing my backpack than to a man with a machete standing over my tent. This was a climbing trip, a real one, deep in the mountains, far from trails, far from rangers, far from anyone who cared about whether or not we camped there. There were 4 of us, spread out on sleeping mats under the open sky. We had spent the day climbing, burning through every bit of energy in our bodies. Nothing makes food taste better than exhaustion, and even though it was just MREs and cheap wine, it might as well have been a feast. By midnight, we were out. Then, at 2 a.m., the voices started. Not one, not two, a crowd. It sounded like a school group, dozens of kids talking at once, moving somewhere in the darkness. The sound rolled through the trees, distant but clear. None of us spoke. We just listened. There were no trails nearby, no roads, no reason for a group, especially a group of children, to be out here. Then another wave of voices passed. Another group, just as large, moving in the same direction as the first. And then we heard footsteps coming toward us. Not the voices, not the groups. Someone, or several people, walking straight toward our camp. I felt my body lock up, that cold rush of adrenaline flooding every inch of my skin. Then we saw them. 5 kids, maybe 13 years old, walking single file. They weren't talking. They weren't using lights. Just moving through the woods in the direction of the other voices. They passed within 3 meters of us. Close enough to see their faces in the moonlight. Close enough that we should have heard them coming earlier. One of them looked at me and nodded. Then they kept walking, disappearing into the trees. No one spoke. We sat there for a long time, listening, waiting. But the voices never came back. Maybe they were scouts. Maybe there was a camp nearby we didn't know about. Maybe they were just weird kids playing some game. But why no lights? Why no trails? Why at 2 a.m., in the middle of nowhere? We didn't go back to sleep. We didn't even talk about it. In the morning, we packed up and left. I've heard plenty of terrifying sounds in the wild. The high-pitched scream of a fox. The guttural roar of a stag in rut. The unearthly shriek of an owl before it dives. But nothing is as scary as people. I've never had an animal watch my camp through binoculars. I've never had a bear ask how many people are in my group. I've never had a mountain lion follow me with a machete in its hands. This is why I go deep into the mountains. Because if something is out there watching me at night, I'd rather it have claws than a smile. I don't think I'll ever forget that night. It's been years, but it still plays in my head like a loop, like a bad dream that won't go away. The sounds, the smell, the way the air felt thick and wrong. Sometimes I still wake up with that screaming in my ears, and there's no getting rid of it. It started out as a regular night, one of those nights you expect to forget by morning. I was visiting a friend in New Rochelle, New York, just catching up, having some drinks, nothing out of the ordinary. We'd gone to a bar, one of those places where you could tell the regulars had been coming for years, their elbows practically worn into the bar top. It was dim inside, loud with conversation, the clatter of glasses, the occasional burst of laughter. It smelled like beer, fried food, and cigarette smoke from the people coming in and out. I was a little buzzed, not falling over drunk, just warm and loose, feeling that easy sway in my head. My friend and I decided to step outside for a cigarette. The night air hit me like a splash of water, cool against my face, clearing some of the fuzz in my brain. The street was quiet, the kind of quiet that only happens in those odd in-between hours when the world slows down. Then, out of nowhere, a car came screaming down the road. I didn't even see it at first, just heard it. That deep, snarling sound of an engine pushed too hard, tires gripping pavement. My head snapped toward the noise just in time to see headlights cutting through the darkness, moving way too fast. The car flew past the bar like it had no intention of stopping for anything. I remember my friend muttering something, maybe a curse, but we were both frozen just watching. The car didn't slow down at the red light. It barely even seemed to hesitate, blowing straight through like the rules of the road didn't apply. It kept going, picking up speed as it started up a hill, the road curving ahead. Something about the way it was moving made my stomach clench. There was no control, no adjustment, just raw speed and reckless direction. I knew, somehow, even before it happened. The driver crossed the double yellow, swerving into the opposite lane. And then impact. The crash wasn't just a sound, it was a physical thing. A deep, gut-wrenching slam, metal crumpling, glass shattering. Both cars lifted up at the back from the force of the collision, almost like they were being yanked upward by invisible strings. Then they dropped back down, slamming onto the pavement with a sickening finality. And then fire. It didn't take long, just a few seconds before flames started licking at the front of the car that had been hit. At first, it was just a flicker, but then it grew, swelling like something alive, bright orange and hungry. Something inside me snapped into motion. I turned and ran back into the bar, my pulse hammering so hard it felt like my whole body was shaking. My buzz was gone, burned away in an instant. I grabbed the fire extinguisher from the wall and shouted at the bartender to call 911. I don't even remember how the words came out, if they made any sense, but I must have gotten the message across because he went straight for the phone. By the time I got back outside, a small group had formed. My friend, a few other people from the bar, all moving toward the wreck. The street was still mostly empty. It was late, and the area wasn't packed with traffic at that hour. We ran. The closer I got, the more I felt it, that horrible heat thick and pulsing, pushing against my skin. The air smelled like burning rubber, gasoline, something acrid that stung my nose. I lifted the fire extinguisher and aimed at the flames, pulling the handle, trying to do something, anything. It didn't work. The spray came out, but it was useless, like throwing a glass of water onto a bonfire. The flames just kept growing, swallowing the front of the car, crawling up the hood, licking at the windshield. The heat was unbearable. It pushed us back, made it impossible to get close enough to do anything. And then, the screaming. I don't have words for that sound. It wasn't just fear. It was pain, raw and unimaginable. It cut through everything else, the crackling fire, the shouting, the sirens that were starting to wail in the distance. It was the sound of someone dying, knowing they were dying. I stood there, frozen. There was nothing I could do. None of us could. I think someone tried to get closer, maybe my friend, maybe someone else, but the heat was too much. We could only stand there, helpless, watching the flames take her. The fire trucks arrived fast, but not fast enough. The fire was still roaring when they pulled up, their lights flashing red and blue, washing over the street, making everything feel even more unreal. The firefighters moved quickly, dragging hoses, spraying the wreckage, but I already knew. We all did. By the time the fire was out, the screaming had stopped. The police took us back to the bar, one by one, asking us what we saw, getting our statements. I don't remember what I said. The words came out of my mouth, but I wasn't really there. My brain felt distant, like it had shut down to keep me from processing what I just witnessed. I found out the next day who she was. She was young, newly married, maybe a new mother. I don't remember exactly. She had been coming home late from work. She was 1 block from home. 1 block. The other driver? Some rich drunk bastard. He lost a leg. That was it. He survived. I don't know if he ever did time. I didn't stick around long enough to find out. I had to leave, had to go back home. But I think about it all the time. I think about her. I think about how close she was to making it home. How she probably had no idea what was coming. How it happened so fast that she didn't even have time to react. I think about the fire, how small it started, how fast it grew. And I think about the screaming. That's what stays with me the most. That sound. That terrible, awful sound. There are some things you don't ever forget. Some things that dig into you, carve themselves into your memory, so deep that no amount of time can scrape them away. This was one of them. I never thought about dying before. Not really. I mean, sure, I had fears of pain, of something happening to my kids, of the slow crawl of old age. But death, the actual moment of it, it was something distant, abstract. The kind of thing that happened to other people. But that changed the day I gave birth to my second child. It wasn't supposed to be like that. I had a plan. I had a team. I had one of the best doctors I could ask for, a woman I trusted completely. Everything was going smoothly, at least as smoothly as a C-section could go. My first birth had been rough, and this time around, preeclampsia made it clear my son needed to get out of me. Fast. The surgery itself wasn't the problem. It was almost casual. I remember lying on the table, my body numb from the chest down, the bright lights making everything feel unreal. My doctor and the nurses were chatting about random things, keeping the mood light. I was listening, adding little bits here and there, feeling like an observer in my own birth. There was no pain, just pressure, the distant tugging and pulling as they worked to bring my son into the world. I felt tired, but that was normal. Surgery does that. I wasn't worried. Then something changed. I wasn't just tired anymore. I was exhausted in a way I had never felt before. It wasn't just sleepiness. It was an overwhelming weight pressing down on me, dragging me deeper. A kind of tired that went beyond my body, beyond my mind. I didn't even want to see my baby. That thought alone should have terrified me, but it didn't. I just didn't care. All I wanted was to sleep. I could hear my doctor's voice, the murmur of nurses, the quiet beeping of the machines. Then, even that started fading. The sounds dulled, like I was slipping underwater. The brightness of the lights dimmed. I wasn't on the table anymore. I was above it. I don't know how to explain it. One moment I was there. The next I wasn't. I felt weightless, floating, hovering 3 feet above the operating table. But my mind was in absolute bliss. I have never felt anything like it, before or since. It wasn't happiness. It wasn't joy. It was relief. Like every worry, every fear, every ounce of stress I had ever carried in my life had been lifted away in an instant. Everything was okay. More than okay. Everything just was. I didn't think about my husband, my kids, my life. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't sad. I wasn't anything except peaceful. There are no words for it. None. I didn't even notice the people below me at first. I was barely aware of them, as if they existed in another world entirely. But something made me look. I don't know if I turned my head or if my perspective just shifted, but I saw him, the guy monitoring my vitals. He was writing something in his notebook, his face calm, focused. Then he looked at the monitor, and everything changed. His face went white, his eyes widened, and his entire body tensed. He froze for half a second, then jolted into motion. He didn't even hesitate. Asterisk, asterisk, oh shit, asterisk, asterisk. His voice slammed into me like a gunshot. Then the injection. I didn't see him do it, but I felt it. A violent electric shockwave tore through me, like someone had grabbed my soul and yanked it back into my body. 1 second, I was floating. The next, I was slammed back onto the operating table. Sound exploded around me. The hum of machines, the chatter of voices, the rustling of scrubs, the beeping of monitors, so much noise. I could feel everything now. Not pain, just an unbearable cold. A deep, gut-wrenching cold that rattled through my bones, turning my body into a shivering, convulsing mess. I couldn't stop shaking. I don't remember what happened next. Not clearly. I remember darkness, voices fading in and out, blurry figures moving around me. I don't remember seeing my baby. I don't remember how long I was in that room. I don't remember much of that night at all. But the next morning, when I woke up, the nurse came in with a question that made everything worse. Have the blood transfusion people been by yet? I frowned. No. She didn't answer. She just left. A few minutes later, my doctor walked in. She looked apologetic. That's when I found out. I had bled out on the table. They had struggled to stop it, struggled to contain it, but I had already lost half my blood volume before they got things under control. Half. And they didn't even give me a transfusion until hours later. The next day, the nurses were laughing about how surprised they were that I could even walk. Like it was some kind of joke. Like I hadn't been dying in that bed while no one told me. But the scariest part? It wasn't almost dying. It was what I had felt when I was dying. Because I know now. I know what it feels like. And it wasn't bad. It was good. Too good. Nothing in life, asterisk, asterisk, nothing, asterisk, asterisk, has ever felt that way. Nothing ever will. I know that now. I've tried to explain it, but words are useless. There's no comparison, no feeling on earth that comes close. Not happiness, not love, not even peace. It was beyond all of that. And that's the part that haunts me. Because I came back. But I don't feel like I belong here anymore. I should have died that day. I was already gone. I felt it. I know it. I had let go. And now I'm just here. I don't know how to explain it, but it feels wrong. I should be dead. I should be there. Not here, struggling through this life, losing my health, my body, my parents. Not here, feeling nothing but this hollow existence. Because the truth is, ever since that day, I've never felt truly alive again. And the scariest part, I don't think I ever will. I had moved to Southeast Washington not long after finishing college. The job was good, steady work, decent pay. But what really got me excited about the area was the hunting. The Blue Mountains were right there, stretching out for miles, wild and remote. It was the kind of country where, if you were willing to push yourself past the easy access spots, you could find places where the only tracks in the dirt belonged to animals. That was what I wanted. Growing up in Montana, I had spent most of my life outdoors. I was raised on a farm and ranch, and that kind of life means you're outside in all weather, all seasons. You learn to work with animals, to listen, to watch. Hunting was part of my upbringing, not just for sport, but as a way to put food on the table. And from an early age, I had a knack for calling animals. I could imitate everything from cattle to coyotes, fooling them just enough to draw them in. By the time I was 10, I had already called in my first predator, a coyote that came trotting in, fooled by my dying jackrabbit impression. It was something I carried with me through the years, refining it, studying how animals sounded, how they responded, and what made them move. By the time hunting season approached in Washington, I had been out scouting several times, always looking for the most remote spots, the ones that would put me miles from any road. I had seen a few promising areas, places where game trails crossed through thick timber or followed the folds of the ridges. But there was always more land to explore. One late afternoon, I loaded up my pack and set out again. It was a bit of a last-minute trip, and I knew I wouldn't get far before dark, but that didn't matter. The goal was to find a good place to glass for game at first light. I parked off a narrow dirt road, shouldered my pack, and started hiking. The air was crisp, cool with the first hints of fall, and the only sounds were the crunch of my boots on dry leaves and the distant calls of birds settling in for the evening. The climb was steady, steep in places, but nothing I wasn't used to. I kept my pace even, drinking water as I went. Hydration was key out here. Dehydration could sneak up on you, and I wasn't about to let that happen. After about 2 miles, I found a ridge with a decent clearing. It wasn't completely level, but it would do. From here, I had a good view of the slopes below and the valley beyond. I set up a dry camp. No fire, just my bivy sack, some food, and my gear. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I spotted a couple of whitetails moving through the trees below, their pale tails flashing as they stepped carefully along a game trail. Nothing too exciting, but it was still good to see activity. I turned in early, pulling my bivy up around me, my rifle and sidearm within reach. The night was quiet, just the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze and the distant hoot of an owl. I woke up at around 1 a.m., and I knew immediately that something was wrong. Pain, a deep, pulsing headache, unlike anything I'd ever felt. It came in waves, starting as a dull throb before ramping up into sharp, almost blinding spikes. I lay there, eyes closed, breathing through it, trying to figure out what had caused it. I knew it wasn't dehydration. I had been careful about that. Altitude, maybe? I had been in higher places before, but something about this felt different. As I lay there, trying to control my breathing, my ears tuned into a sound. At first, I thought I was imagining it. A distant call, low and deep, coming from somewhere up the mountain. It wasn't a bird. I knew that immediately. It had too much depth, too much resonance. It sounded big. I've spent my whole life listening to animal calls, learning them, imitating them. This wasn't anything I recognized. It had a rhythm, but not one that made sense. Most animal calls have a pattern, a certain repetition, a reason behind them. This was off. A hollow, drawn-out sound, almost like a whoop, but too deep, too powerful. It echoed through the trees, coming in steady intervals. The headache surged again, making it hard to focus. I wanted to tell myself it was just some Washington bird I wasn't familiar with, but I knew that wasn't true. This was a mammal, a big one. I lay still, listening, my mind trying to put a name to what I was hearing. The call continued, unwavering, always from the same direction, above me, somewhere on the mountainside. By 2 a.m., the decision was made. I wasn't staying. I had never left a camp in the middle of the night before, but something about this situation felt wrong. The headache, the unrelenting sound, the sheer unnaturalness of it. I packed up quickly, stuffing my gear into my pack with hurried movements. My .45 was already in my hand, safety off. The way back to my truck could go two ways. I could take the direct route back down the way I came, rough, steep, and filled with deadfall, or I could take the gated road that ran above my campsite and looped back down. It was longer, but it was easier to walk in the dark. There was just one problem. The road led me toward the sound before curving back to the truck. I started walking. The night was black, the moon barely lighting the trees. My boots crunched softly on the dirt road, and the air felt heavy, thick. My breathing was still off, like I couldn't quite get enough oxygen. The sound continued, and then I realized something. It was following me. Always above, always just far enough away that I couldn't see movement through the trees, but close enough that I could feel it. Every time I stopped, it stopped. Every time I moved, it moved. I kept my pace steady, my grip tight on the pistol. Whatever it was watching me. I don't know how long I walked like that, but eventually, the road started to drop back down. And as soon as I descended, something changed. The headache was gone. It left as suddenly as it had come, like a weight lifting off my skull. My breathing smoothed out, my vision cleared. And the sound, it had stopped. When I got home, I sat at my desk and started looking up bird calls. I spent hours trying to find something that matched what I had heard. Nothing did. That nagging voice in my head told me to look up something I never thought I would, Bigfoot calls. And there it was, almost exactly what I had heard, recorded by people who claimed to have encountered the same thing. I don't know what I heard that night. I went back to that area a few more times, but I never heard it again. I even walked through the section of thick, tangled trees where the sound had originated, but I found nothing. No tracks, no sign of anything unusual. I don't believe in fairy tales. But I know animals, and I know what I heard wasn't normal. And I know something followed me out of those mountains that night. I wish I could say I don't think about it much anymore, that it's just another tragic story that fades into the background over time. But it's not. It lingers, settles deep, and never really leaves. I didn't know them well, not like their families or closest friends, but I knew enough to feel the weight of it. And I was there in the aftermath. I saw the devastation firsthand. It was one of those nights where nothing really seems out of the ordinary, at least not at first. A weekend. A small, rural town where there isn't much to do but drink, drive around, and kill time in familiar places with familiar people. The roads are quiet. Not empty, but quiet. Street lights are spread far apart, patches of darkness stretching in between. You hear your own tires more than you see the road ahead. 3 young guys, barely out of their teens, were doing what plenty of others did, drinking in town, cutting loose, making their own fun. They were friends, almost like brothers, 2 of them first cousins. They had been at a bar, or maybe just drinking somewhere nearby. The details on that part never really mattered. What mattered was that 2 of them decided to leave earlier than the third. They had a plan, or at least an idea. They were staying at another friend's house, but when the third guy called, or texted, or somehow got in touch, they figured they'd go back for him. Maybe he needed a ride. Maybe he just wanted to keep the night going. Maybe they just didn't want to leave him stranded. They knew they couldn't drive right into town, not with alcohol on their breath, not with the risk of police being around. So they went to the closest point where town met the outskirts. A quiet spot, just rural enough that they could pick him up without attracting attention. It should have been a short drive. 10 minutes, maybe. The guy in the passenger seat uploaded a Snapchat story while they were on their way. Music blasted through the car, rattling the speakers. No seatbelts. The driver, one of the cousins, held a beer in one hand, a cigarette in the other. The glow of it flickered as he took a drag. The car sped down the road, headlights cutting through the dark. The world blurred past them. It probably felt like nothing could touch them, like they were invincible. They made it into town just long enough to pick up their friend. He got in the back seat, and then they were on their way again, heading home. But they never made it. At some point, maybe minutes later, maybe seconds, the driver lost control. Maybe the alcohol dulled his reflexes. Maybe the speed was too much for the road. Maybe the music, the laughing, the heat of the moment distracted him just enough to miss the warning signs. The slight drift, the feeling of the tires struggling to grip the pavement. Maybe he thought he had it, but he didn't. The car veered off course. It wasn't a slow skid, not a gentle swerve. It was fast, brutal. The tires screeched. The headlights swung wildly. And then, before anyone had a chance to react, they crashed. Straight into a concrete wall. The impact was instant. Violent. The guy in the passenger seat, barely older than a kid, was thrown forward. No seatbelt to hold him back. He went through the windshield. The glass shattered around him, slicing, tearing, but it didn't matter. He was gone before his body even hit the ground. The driver, the cousin, was barely alive. His body took the force of the crash, ribs crushed, skull fractured. His pulse was faint, his breath shallow. He was resuscitated at the scene, but there was almost nothing left of him. The third guy, the one who had been sitting in the back, was unconscious, barely breathing. His head was swollen, blood leaking from his nose and ears. They said later that his leg got caught when he was thrown forward, keeping him from being flung out like the others. That small twist of fate saved his life. But nobody knew that yet. At the hospital, everything blurred together. The waiting, the pacing, the crying. The quiet, suffocating dread. Family members of all three boys filled the ICU, clinging to the little hope they had left. It didn't last long. The family of the guy in the passenger seat already knew. There was no coming back for him. He was gone. But the others, they still had machines keeping them alive, tubes, monitors, the artificial hum of life support. Doctors spoke in low, careful voices, but the words still cut deep. The driver was brain dead. He would never wake up again. The family had to make a decision, even though there was no real choice to make. The third guy was worse off than anyone could process. His brain injury was severe. They couldn't even assess how much damage had been done because it was too much. They said he probably wouldn't make it. And if he did, he wouldn't be the same. He'd be a vegetable, a hollow body in a hospital bed. People were told to say their goodbyes. The driver was taken off life support first. Another loss, another young life gone in an instant. The weight of it was unbearable. 2 first cousins dead. One family grieving their son, another grieving their nephew, waiting for their own son to follow. But then, something happened. Something nobody expected. The third guy didn't die. Day by day, against everything the doctors had predicted, he started to recover. His injuries were bad, but his body fought through it. His brain adapted. His strength came back. His leg was broken, but that was nothing compared to what could have been. It should have been good news. A miracle, even. But grief doesn't work that way. The families of the 2 cousins, once united in their loss, turned cold toward him. At first, they were sympathetic, maybe even relieved that he survived. But that changed. Their sons were gone, and he was still here. He walked out of that hospital while they buried their children, and they needed someone to blame. They turned it on him, said he was the reason their sons got back in the car that night, said if he hadn't needed a ride, they never would have gone back into town, never would have been on that road, never would have crashed. It didn't matter that their own son was behind the wheel, that he was the one drinking, the one speeding, the one who should have known better. Grief doesn't care about reason. It just needs a place to land. And so it landed on the only person left alive. I think about that a lot, about how close he came to dying, how much he lost that night even though he survived, about how grief can twist and turn and find a way to hurt even those who didn't do anything wrong. People hear stories like this all the time. They read about them in the news, see a quick headline, maybe say, "Wow, that's sad," before moving on with their day. But when you live it, when you see the wreckage, stand in the hospital, watch families break apart under the weight of it, you realize how much more there is. The rumors, the blame, the way grief turns people into something else entirely, the way it never really ends, and how it all could have been avoided with one simple thing: a seatbelt. That's the part that never stops haunting me. The first time I heard about one of the missing kids, I didn't think much of it. Kids went missing sometimes. They ran away, or their parents sent them to stay with family, or they just slipped through the cracks. In the neighborhoods where I grew up, places where folks worked long hours for little pay, where kids played in the streets because there wasn't anywhere else to go, disappearances happened. People noticed, but not for long. The world kept moving, same as it always did. But this was different. It was early 1980 when I really started paying attention. I was 17, too old to be one of the kids who'd vanished, but young enough to know them, or at least know of them. I lived in a small apartment with my mother, just the two of us. My dad had been gone since I was 5, and I didn't remember much about him. Mama worked cleaning houses on the wealthy side of town, leaving before sunrise and coming home long after dark. Most nights, I was alone. The news came in pieces. A kid from over in Mechanicsville gone 1 week, another from Bankhead missing the next. It was mostly boys, mostly around my age or younger, and all of them were black. At first, the police barely seemed to notice. Just another runaway, they said. Just another kid who didn't come home. Then they started finding the bodies. The first one I remember hearing about was found in the woods, near a road, not too far from where I lived. I didn't know the boy, but I knew someone who did. We all did. That was the thing about our neighborhoods. Everybody knew everybody, or at least knew someone who did. I remember walking to the corner store that night, feeling a weight in the air that hadn't been there before. The streets were quiet, the usual clusters of kids gone. Parents had started keeping their kids inside, locking their doors before the sun even set. It wasn't safe anymore. The fear spread fast. People started whispering about a killer, someone hunting black kids. But outside of our neighborhoods, nobody seemed to care. The news barely covered it at first. The police didn't seem interested. They'd show up when a body turned up, write a report, and then move on. And the bodies kept turning up. A few months later, they found 2 more bodies in the Chattahoochee River. This time, I knew one of them, Eddie, a kid I'd seen around but never really talked to. He wasn't much younger than me, maybe 15, and he used to ride his bike up and down our street like he had nowhere else to be. The last time I saw him, he was standing outside the convenience store, drinking a Coke and talking to some older guys. Then, just like that, he was gone. When they pulled his body from the river, the police barely said a word. No press conference, no big investigation. Just another dead black kid. That was the moment it really sank in for me. Whoever was doing this, they weren't stopping. And nobody outside of our communities cared enough to stop them. That summer, the city felt different. Normally, our neighborhoods were full of life. Kids playing in the streets, music blasting from open windows, people sitting on porches talking long into the night. But now, the streets were empty. Parents kept their kids inside. People stopped going out unless they had to. One night, I was walking home from a friend's house when I noticed how quiet everything was. No kids, no laughter, no music. Just the sound of my own footsteps on the pavement. It felt like the whole city was holding its breath, waiting for whatever was coming next. I started walking faster. I lived in a rough neighborhood, but I'd never felt unsafe before. I knew the streets, knew the people. But now, there was something else out there. Something we couldn't see, something that could take you in the blink of an eye. That night, I pushed my dresser in front of my bedroom door before I went to sleep. The killings went on for almost 2 years before they finally arrested someone. Wayne Williams. That was his name. The police said he was the killer, the one who'd been taking our kids. They arrested him after they saw him on a bridge late at night, right after they heard a splash in the water below. The next day, another body washed up downstream. They put him on trial for 2 murders, 2 adults, not the kids. But after he was convicted, the police closed the cases anyway. They said it was over. They said they got their guy. And just like that, people stopped talking about it. The news moved on. The city took a deep breath and let it go. But not everybody believed it. Even back then, people whispered that Wayne Williams hadn't done it. Not all of it, at least. Some said he was a scapegoat, someone they could blame so the city could move on. Others thought maybe he had killed some of them, but not all. And what scared me the most was that after they arrested him, the killings stopped. That didn't make sense. Not if there was more than one killer. For years, I tried to forget. I told myself it was over. I moved out of Atlanta, got a job, built a life. But every once in a while, I'd see a news story, a documentary, something that brought it all back. Then, in the spring of 2019, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The new mayor of Atlanta announced that the cases were being reopened. After almost 40 years, they were finally looking again. I sat there staring at the screen, feeling like I was 17 again, walking through those silent streets. They told us it was over. They told us we were safe. But deep down, I think we all knew the truth. It was never over. It just stopped. I still remember the weight of my backpack as we stepped onto the train. It felt heavier than it had when we left home, though I knew that was impossible. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was nerves. Either way, as I shifted the straps and settled into the seat beside my best friend, I told myself that this was the adventure we had been waiting for. We had planned everything, or at least as much as two 16-year-old girls could. We didn't have much money, so hostels were out of the question. But we had done this kind of thing before. We had grown up in a rural area where camping in the wild was second nature. A few weeks in the French countryside, sleeping under the stars, sounded like a dream. The kind of freedom we had always wanted. The train carried us south, past endless fields, small towns, and unfamiliar stations. Some nights we found safe places to rest, train stations, guarded beach bars where kind strangers let us sleep under shelter. Other nights, we barely slept at all, too uncomfortable or too aware of how alone we were. But that was all part of it. That was what made it exciting. Eventually, we reached a small town by the Mediterranean. We were exhausted, hungry, and a little disoriented, but when we saw the beach, everything felt worth it. The sand stretched out before us, the water shimmering under the late afternoon sun. It was beautiful, quiet. We found a good spot near the edge of the beach, away from the main path, but close enough that we could see the occasional passerby. The wind had started to pick up, and the sky was darker than before. A storm was coming in. We weren't worried. We set up our tent, securing it to the concrete pillars that held garbage cans. The wind tugged at the fabric as we worked, snapping it like a flag, but once it was tied down, it felt sturdy enough. As we finished, I noticed an older man standing a little ways down the beach. He was fishing, his pole angled toward the water, but he wasn't paying attention to it. He was watching us. I waved. He waved back. It didn't seem strange at the time. People stared all the time. Two young girls camping alone on the beach probably stood out. We had gotten used to it. The storm rolled in as night fell. We crawled into the tent, exhausted. The wind howled outside, rattling the fabric. Rain pattered against the nylon. It was comforting in a way, the kind of noise that made it easier to sleep. I pulled my sleeping bag tight around me and let myself drift off. Sometime in the night, I felt a hand on my shoulder. Not from outside, my friend. She was poking me. Not shaking me, just a small, hesitant touch. When I opened my eyes, I could barely see her in the darkness, but I could tell something was wrong. Her breathing was too quiet. Then she whispered, "There's someone outside the tent, touching me." I froze. The wind was still screaming, the rain still falling, but underneath it, I could hear something else. The faintest rustling. A pressure against the tent wall, like fingers pressing through the fabric. A slow, deliberate brushing sound. We didn't move. Our knives were in our bags, within reach. I felt my fingers close around the handle, my grip so tight my knuckles ached. My heart was pounding, so loud I thought whoever was outside would hear it. Then the poking started again. A slow, deliberate prod against the tent wall. Not like an animal sniffing around. This was intentional. I couldn't sit there and do nothing. I whispered, "Screw it." And before I could second-guess myself, I yanked the zipper down. The wind tore into the tent immediately, whipping rain into my face. But that wasn't what made my stomach drop. Standing right outside, half crouched near the tent, was the fisherman. His face was blank. No expression. Just standing there, looking at us like this was completely normal. He started talking immediately, his voice almost lost in the wind. He told us he was trying to wake us up because there were rats outside, eating the food we had left in our pot. That was why he had been touching the tent. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But why was he still here? It was 2 a.m. The rain was coming down in sheets. The wind was howling. He said he was meeting his friends to go night fishing. There was no one else on the beach. No boats. No lights. Just him. We lied. Told him our parents were staying at a hotel in town. That they were expecting us in the morning. That we weren't alone. He didn't react. Just stood there watching. Then he said his friends would be there soon. I don't remember making the decision to pack up. It just happened. My hands were moving before my brain caught up. I yanked the ties off the concrete, stuffing everything I could into my bag. The tent, still half attached, caught the wind like a sail. Before I could grab it, the storm ripped it away. We watched, helpless, as it tumbled down the beach, then out into the water. Gone. We had nothing left but our bags. And the fisherman was still there. Still watching. We didn't speak. Didn't think. We just ran. We didn't stop until we were back in town. The streets were deserted, the storm making everything feel hollow and empty. We searched for shelter, finally finding a small, walled-off patio behind a building. It wasn't much, but it was hidden, safe. We stayed there until morning. We tried to find a hostel, but we were too tired, too shaken. Every time we passed someone on the street, I felt my stomach clench, expecting to see that man again. We couldn't do this anymore. We found the train station, bought the first ticket home. For days, that was all we lasted. We had planned for 2 weeks, had dreamed of adventure, of freedom. Instead, we got this. As the train pulled away, I stared out the window, watching the town shrink into the distance. My friend sat beside me, silent. Neither of us said it out loud, but we both knew. We weren't doing this again. I had never thought much about fear. Not real fear, at least. The kind that creeps into your bones and changes the way you see everything. I thought I understood it. Those brief spikes of adrenaline when you hear an unexpected noise at night, or when someone startles you from behind. But fear isn't always sudden. Sometimes it's slow, stretching out over weeks, creeping in so subtly that by the time you realize it, it's already wrapped around you, constricting. That's what happened to me. I had always been fascinated by snakes. Not in the casual way people might admire them from behind glass at a zoo, but in the way that made me want to live alongside them. I had owned a few smaller snakes over the years, ball pythons mostly, and they were beautiful in their own way, but I had always wanted something bigger, something more impressive, something that felt like a true companion. That's how I ended up with my reticulated python, Orion. He was still young when I got him, only about 5 feet long, but I knew what I was signing up for. Retics grow fast, and they don't stop growing for a long time. By the time he was 5 years old, he was over 15 feet long. By the time he was 10, he was closer to 18. Thick, powerful, his scales shining with iridescence under the light, shifting between gold and deep green. I had raised him from the time he was small enough to wrap around my arm like a bracelet, and in my mind, he wasn't just a pet. He was family. I lived alone, a small apartment in Los Angeles, just outside the city where landlords didn't ask too many questions about what you kept in your home. My life was quiet, mostly work and time spent caring for Orion. He had a massive custom-built enclosure in my living room, but most nights he wasn't in it. He preferred to be with me, and I liked it that way. I'd let him slither around the apartment, stretching out across the floor, his body moving in slow, methodical waves. At night, he slept at the foot of my bed, always curled up in a neat coil, his smooth scales pressed against the blankets, the occasional flicker of his tongue the only sign that he was awake. It felt comforting, knowing he was there, his presence a quiet reassurance in the dark. But then something changed. It was subtle at first, small things that I barely noticed. He stopped eating as much. Orion had always been a good eater, lunging at his food with the precision of a hunter, constricting it even though it was already dead. But now, he barely acknowledged the rabbits I placed in his enclosure. He'd flick his tongue a few times, coil around them without squeezing, then leave them untouched. I figured he just wasn't hungry. Snakes could go a long time without eating, and fasting wasn't unheard of, especially for a snake his size. But then he started moving differently. During the day, he was more active than usual. Instead of lazily basking under the heat lamp or curling up in his usual spots, he explored. He moved across the apartment with an unusual sense of purpose, his tongue flicking constantly as if he were searching for something. And then there were the nights. Orion no longer curled up at the foot of my bed. Instead, he stretched out beside me. The first time it happened, I barely registered it. I had fallen asleep like usual, the soft weight of the blankets comforting, the quiet hum of the city outside my window. But when I woke up in the middle of the night, I realized that Orion wasn't in his usual place. He was alongside me. His body was stretched out, running parallel to mine from head to toe, his cool scales pressed against my arm. His breathing was slow, steady, his long body perfectly aligned with mine. I remember lying there, feeling his weight against me, my mind still fogged with sleep. I reached out, running my hand along his back, feeling the smooth ridges of his muscles shifting beneath my touch. I figured he was just seeking warmth. But then it happened again, and again. Every night, Orion stretched out beside me, perfectly aligned, his head near my shoulder, his tail reaching toward my feet. He never curled up anymore, never settled at the foot of the bed like he used to. I told myself it was nothing. But then, one night, I woke up to something strange. I had been dreaming, though I don't remember about what. But when I opened my eyes, there was a weight on my chest. Not heavy enough to pin me, but enough to make my breathing feel different. It was Orion. His head was resting on my chest, his tongue flicking out in slow, deliberate intervals. His body was still stretched out, his thick coils draped across the bed. His eyes were open, unblinking in the dark. I stared at him, my heart pounding. Something felt wrong. I reached up slowly, running my fingers along his smooth scales. He didn't move. For the first time, I felt uneasy. The next morning, I called the exotic vet. I had taken Orion there a few times before, just for routine checkups. The vet was used to handling large snakes, used to the quirks and behaviors of reticulated pythons. I explained what had been happening, how Orion had stopped eating, how he had started stretching out beside me at night, how he had lain across my chest in the middle of the night. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then, in a firm, measured tone, the vet told me to bring Orion in immediately. I did. The moment I arrived, the vet took one look at Orion and then looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite place. Concern, maybe, or something more urgent. Then, in the same calm voice, he told me something that made my stomach drop. Your snake is preparing to eat you. I remember standing there, staring at him, waiting for him to laugh, to tell me he was joking. But he wasn't. Orion had stopped eating because he was making room. He had been stretching out alongside me, measuring my body, calculating whether he could swallow me whole. And when he rested his head on my chest that night, he had been testing to see if he could strike. If he could latch onto my face, coil around me, and do what instinct told him to do. I stood there, feeling the weight of Orion in my arms, feeling the slow movement of his muscles beneath his skin. I had loved him, trusted him, but he had never been a pet. He had never been family. He had been a predator, and I had been prey. I got rid of him that same day. I didn't watch when they took him away. I didn't ask where he was going. I just left. That night, when I lay down in bed, there was no weight at the foot of it. No cool scales pressed against my skin. No slow, deliberate breathing beside me. And for the first time in years, I felt truly alone. But I was alive. I don't know what made my grandparents stop at that little roadside shop in New Mexico. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe they just needed a break from the long ride back to Texas. Either way, they pulled off the highway, parked their motorcycle, and stepped inside the small, quiet shop sitting at the edge of the reservation. The shop was nothing special, just a dusty little building, the kind of place you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. Inside, shelves lined the walls, filled with wooden carvings, beaded jewelry, small trinkets, and handmade blankets. The air smelled of old wood and something faintly smoky, like a fire had burned there long ago. The man running the shop was friendly. My grandparents talked with him for a while, just small talk, nothing too deep. Before they left, he sold them a few small wooden figures. Nothing fancy, just little carved people, simple and worn, as if they had been handled many times before. My grandpa told me later that he didn't think much of them at the time. He just liked the way they looked. When they got home, they put the figures on a shelf upstairs, near the hallway that led to their bedroom. There was a small wooden pedestal there, something my grandma used for decorations. The figures fit perfectly. She arranged them neatly, dusted off her hands, and didn't think about them again. That night, my grandpa woke up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. It wasn't unusual for him. He was getting older, and he never slept through the night anymore. He got out of bed, careful not to wake my grandma, and stepped into the dark hallway. The bathroom was just down the hall, not far from the bedroom. He didn't even bother turning on the light. He had lived in that house for years. He knew every step, every shadow. The floor creaked softly under his feet as he made his way inside, closed the door, and relieved himself. It was quiet, just the sound of water hitting the porcelain, the faint hum of the house settling around him. Then, as he reached for the sink to wash his hands, he heard it. Footsteps, running footsteps, fast, light, darting up and down the hallway outside the bathroom door. My grandpa froze, his hands still dripping. He wasn't the type to scare easily, but something about the sound made the hairs on his arms stand up. It wasn't slow, steady walking. It wasn't the sound of someone creeping around. It was full speed running, back and forth, over and over, like a child playing tag in the dead of night. He turned off the water and listened. The footsteps didn't stop. They just kept going, pounding against the floor. The hall wasn't long enough for someone to run like that. The moment they reached the end, they should have had to turn around, slow down. But there was no hesitation, no pause. Just constant movement, back and forth, like whatever was out there wasn't bound by the space of the hallway at all. He swallowed, took a slow breath, and pulled open the bathroom door. Silence. The air was still, heavy, as if the house itself had been holding its breath. He stepped out, his eyes adjusting to the darkness, scanning the hallway. At the very end of the hall, just beyond the weak glow coming from the bedroom, stood a figure. At first, my grandpa thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. The hallway was already dark, but this thing, this shape, was darker than the shadows around it. It didn't move. It didn't breathe. It didn't shift. It was just there, standing at the end of the hall, like a cutout in reality itself. It had no details, no face, no features. It was just empty, a void in the shape of a person. My grandpa didn't move. He just stood there, gripping the edge of the bathroom doorframe, staring at it. His chest tightened. He wasn't sure if he was breathing. The figure didn't do anything. It didn't twitch, didn't sway, didn't lean forward. It just slowly, so painfully slowly, began to glide backward. Not walk, not turn around, just drift. It slid across the floor without sound, moving toward the open bedroom door. My grandma was still inside, asleep, unaware. My grandpa watched as the thing reached the doorway, never breaking its shape, never showing a single sign of life. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it pulled the door shut. Click. The latch slid into place. My grandpa stood there for what felt like hours, his body rigid, his heart thudding against his ribs. He didn't know how long he stood there before his legs finally worked again. He moved forward, reaching out, hesitating for the first time in his life before touching a doorknob in his own home. It turned easily. The door swung open, revealing the bedroom. Nothing. Just my grandma, still fast asleep, the covers rising and falling with her steady breathing. There was no sign of the figure. No sign that anything had been in there at all. But my grandpa didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, he told my grandma. She listened carefully, her face unreadable. Then, without hesitation, she went to the hallway shelf and picked up the wooden figures. She didn't touch them like they were cursed or dangerous. She handled them the way you would something fragile, something that didn't belong. Without a word, she took them outside. She blessed them. She burned them. Then she threw them away. My grandpa didn't argue. Neither of them spoke about it again, not for years. Even now, long after they're both gone, I think about that night. I think about the way my grandpa told me the story, the way his voice had gone quiet, how his eyes had drifted somewhere far away, as if he was seeing it all over again. I think about the way he described that figure, standing there, unmoving, without breath, without life. And I wonder if, somewhere out there, it's still waiting. I remember the clouds that morning. Thick, gray, unmoving. The kind of sky that promised a long, slow workday. Not cold, not warm, just heavy air pressing down like a damp towel. I worked at a jet ski rental, a summer job that should have been all about easy cash and easy days. But the job had its moments. Some days, I barely lifted a finger, just sat around waiting for customers that never came. Other days, things got hectic. Broken jet skis, clueless tourists, drunk guys thinking they could race at full speed and not flip. But nothing, not a single day before or after, was like this one. I walked into work expecting a slow shift. I wasn't even fully on the clock yet, my bag still slung over my shoulder, my mind half asleep. But the moment the dock came into view, I knew something was wrong. My coworkers were running. Not walking, not jogging, but full-on sprinting toward the jet ski we kept tied to the dock for emergencies. I stopped in my tracks, still holding my bag, and watched them scramble onto it. My heart kicked up a little. We had rescue calls all the time, people falling off, people drifting too far, engines stalling. But something about the way they moved made my stomach tighten. I dropped my bag in the employee shed, my eyes locked on the water, scanning for whatever had them in such a rush. The lake stretched out in front of me, rippling under the cloudy sky, nothing out of place at first glance. But I could feel it. Something was wrong. I saw them reach the customer. A big guy, a huge guy, easily over 250 pounds, maybe closer to 300. He was in the water, not moving much, arms sluggish, barely keeping himself afloat. They weren't just checking on him, they were hauling him onto the rescue board. I didn't think. I just moved. There was another jet ski free at the dock, one of the spares we kept ready. I hopped on, fired up the engine, and shot out toward them. The second I got closer, I could see it in their faces. Panic. Urgency. They needed another set of hands. As I pulled up, I barely had time to register what was happening before I was given a simple instruction. Drive. I didn't hesitate. The man was already on the rescue board, his head lolling slightly, his arms limp. We weren't far from the docks, but I pushed the throttle as hard as I dared. The lake felt huge and empty, nothing around us but the distant echo of waves slapping against the shore. The sound of the engine filled my head, drowning out everything else. Somewhere along the way, it clicked. This wasn't just a guy who fell off his jet ski. He wasn't just exhausted. He wasn't just struggling to climb back on. He was dying. I gritted my teeth, eyes locked on the dock ahead. I couldn't afford to think beyond the task in front of me. Get him back. Get him on land. Asterisk, that was all that mattered. We reached the dock, and I barely had time to cut the engine before my co-worker and I were lifting him. Lifting him out of the water. I don't know where the strength came from. Maybe adrenaline, maybe fear. I wasn't a big guy, neither was my co-worker, but somehow we got him onto the dock. His skin was pale, lips tinged blue. I pressed my fingers to his neck. A pulse. Weak. Thready. I dropped to my knees beside him and started CPR. Everything blurred. My hands pressed down on his chest, again and again, counting in my head, my arms burning. My co-worker took turns with me. The two of us locked into the rhythm of it. The dock under my knees was wet, probably from the water dripping off him, maybe from us. Time didn't make sense. The world had shrunk down to the rise and fall of his chest under my hands, the desperate hope that his body would respond. I didn't know how long we kept at it. 5 minutes. 10. I lost track. Then sirens. I never knew sirens could sound so good. The ambulance skidded to a stop near the rental hut. Paramedics ran down, their voices sharp and focused. They took over in an instant, their movements smooth, practiced. Someone must have called them the second we got him onto the dock. I stepped back, suddenly aware of how hard I was breathing. My arms shook. My whole body shook. I looked at my co-workers, kids, just like me, all of us standing there, wide-eyed, silent. The police chief arrived after the paramedics loaded him into the ambulance. He looked at us, taking in the scene, and gave a small nod. We had done everything right. We had given him a fighting chance. Relief crashed over me, so sudden it made me dizzy. The weight of what just happened settled in, but the terror started to fade. He was in good hands now. We had done our part. Our boss canceled the rest of the workday. None of us could focus anyway. The plan was to go back to someone's place, grab a drink, calm the nerves. The mood on the car ride was a strange mix, nervous laughter, shaky excitement. The shock was wearing off, replaced by something else. Pride. We saved someone. We kept replaying it in our heads, every moment, every decision, and realizing we had done everything textbook perfect. No hesitation, no missteps. We were just kids, but we had worked together like we'd trained for this our whole lives. Then my phone rang. My boss. The second I answered, I knew. I didn't even need him to say it. His voice was quiet, but heavy, and it hit me like a punch to the chest. The man had died in the ambulance. I don't remember exactly what I said back. Just a numb response, something automatic. Then I hung up. The car was still filled with that jittery energy, the high of what we'd just been through. They were all waiting for me to tell them something, maybe another good piece of news. Maybe that the guy was awake, that he was going to be okay. Instead, I told them the truth. The car went silent. No one spoke. No one moved. The weight of it pressed down on all of us at once. All that effort, all that adrenaline, all those perfect choices. And in the end, it still wasn't enough. We had saved a man's life for a few extra minutes. I don't remember much of what happened after that. I know we still went to someone's place. I know we still had that drink, but it didn't taste the same. The laughter didn't come as easily. We sat there, quiet, lost in our own thoughts. The man was in his early 30s. He seemed fine. He wasn't out of shape. He wasn't doing anything reckless. Just riding a jet ski on a cloudy day. And then his heart stopped. No warning. No signs. Just like that. I think about him sometimes. I don't even know his name. I don't know if he had a wife, kids, a family waiting for him to come home. I don't know if that morning he had any idea that it would be his last. I don't think any of us ever fully moved on from that day. It was a reminder, one I never asked for, but one I can't ignore. Life is fragile, more fragile than we ever realize.